Eleanor Whitmore pressed her father's ledger flat against her chest and did not weep, though every soul in that Virginia parlor had leaned forward to watch her break. She had just heard a man she'd never once spoken to decide the whole of her life in 6 cold words. "The plain one will do." Judge Nathaniel Caldwell had said, "Not cruel, not kind, only certain the way a man prices a horse." But Eleanor knew that ledger better than any man breathing, and she lifted her chin. If you believe a woman's worth was never his to name, go on and subscribe. Stay with me, clear to the end, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from, so I can see just how far this story travels. The words had been spoken in another house miles off before Eleanor Whitmore ever heard them. But they reached her all the same, the way a stone thrown in one pond somehow ripples across every water in the county. It happened like this. Nathaniel Caldwell sat at the long table in his study, with the summer heat pressing at the shutters, and he did not look up from the estate ledger when the matter of his marriage was laid before him. Edwin Marsh, his attorney these 11 years, stood at his shoulder with a folded paper in his hand, and the names of 5 women written upon it. "You said you'd hear the list today," Marsh said. "I'm hearing it." "You're reading numbers." "I can do both, Edwin." Nathaniel turned a page. "Read them." Marsh cleared his throat. "Miss Caroline Ashford. Her father holds 400 acres along the river bottom, and she is by every account the loveliest girl in 3 counties. There's not a young man from here to Richmond who wouldn't—" "Next." Marsh blinked. "You've not asked a single question about her." "I don't need to. You said loveliest. Loveliest means courted. Courted means promises made, letters kept a dozen men with a grievance the day she marries me. I want no grievances." He dipped his pen. "Next, Miss Sophia Bell, younger, sweet-tempered they say. Sweet-tempered, meaning simple. Meaning she'll run my house like a child runs a dollhouse, and I'll be settling her debts by Christmas. Next." The attorney's jaw tightened, but he read on because he had learned long ago that Nathaniel Caldwell did not argue. He simply waited for a man to finish being wrong. 2 more names, 2 more dismissals, each one landing quicker than the last, until only the final name remained on the paper, and Marsh looked at it and hesitated in a way he had not hesitated at any of the others. "Well," Nathaniel said, "the last is Miss Eleanor Whitmore." The pen did not stop. "Whitmore," Nathaniel repeated. "The Land Whitmores, old Josiah's people. His daughter, his only child now that he's passed, God rest him." Marsh folded the paper against his chest as though he'd rather not go on. "But I'll be plain with you, sir. I only wrote her down to fill the page. You won't want her." At last, Nathaniel raised his head. It was the first thing Marsh had said all morning that interested him. "Why not?" "On account of, well." Marsh shifted his weight. "She's plain, sir. Plain as a fence post, folks say. And worse than plain, she's the one nobody took. 3 seasons she's been out and not a single offer. The girls whisper she's cold. The mothers say she's odd. She keeps to her father's books instead of company, and there's them that call her—" He lowered his voice as if the word itself might carry irrelevant. "That's the word they use in the parlors. The irrelevant Whitmore girl." "Irrelevant," Nathaniel said. "Their word, sir, not mine." Nathaniel set his pen down. He leaned back in the chair, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, and Marsh had known him long enough to fear that silence more than any raised voice. "You've just spent an hour," Nathaniel said finally, "telling me that 4 of these women are wanted, courted, admired, loved even. And you've handed me one who is none of those things." He tapped the table once with a single finger. "Do you understand what wanted means, Edwin? Wanted means expensive. Wanted means every man in the county thinks he had a claim on her first. Wanted means a marriage that begins in debt and jealousy and never gets clear of it." He looked toward the shuttered window, though there was nothing to see. "I don't want a wanted woman. I want a woman no one will fight me for, sir. Whose lands sit clean beside mine. Whose father left no sons to quarrel over the will. Whose name carries no scandal because it carries no attention at all." He nodded slowly, as though the arithmetic had at last balanced. "The plain one will do." Marsh stared at him. You'll not even meet her first." "I've met the Ledgers. That's enough. Judge Caldwell." The attorney set the paper down flat on the table, and there was something in his manner now that was almost pleading. "She's a person, not a boundary line. There's a woman on the end of that name who's going to hear that a man chose her for being the one nobody else wanted, and I've known some cruel arrangements in my years, but it isn't cruelty." Nathaniel's voice did not rise. It never did. "Cruelty would be lying to her. I'll not lie to her. I'll tell her exactly what she is to me and exactly what she gains, and she can weigh it like any sensible person weighs a contract. That's more honesty than most brides ever get." He picked his pen back up. "Draw up the terms. She protects her father's estate rights under my name. I get an heir and a quiet house. Society gets its silence." He returned to the numbers. "Everyone leaves the table with more than they came with. That's a fair bargain, Edwin, whatever the parlors call it." And that was how it was decided. A woman's whole life settled between two men over an open ledger on a hot afternoon without a single word from her. The word reached the Whitmore house 3 days later, and it did not come gently. It came through the front door in the person of Thomas Whitmore, Eleanor's cousin, who had never once knocked in his life and did not begin now. Eleanor heard his boots in the hall before she heard his voice, and she did not rise from the writing desk where she sat with the household accounts spread before her. She only turned another page and made a small notation in the margin, the way she had done every morning for 3 years since the fever took her father, and left the whole of Whitmore land resting on her 2 shoulders. "You've heard, I suppose," Thomas said from the doorway. "Heard what, cousin?" "Don't play the fool with me, Eleanor. It's all over the county. Caldwell." He came in without invitation and stood over her desk, blocking what light there was. "The judge means to marry you." Her pen paused, just for a breath. Then it moved on. "Does he?" she said. "You don't seem surprised." "I'm surprised he could spell my name. We've never met." She finished the line she was writing and set the pen in its rest. "Sit down, Thomas. You're breathing on my ink." He did not sit. "Do you understand what this means? Do you understand what he's doing?" He planted both hands on the desk and leaned toward her, and there was something hungry underneath his temper that she had learned to watch for. "He's not marrying a woman. He's marrying acreage. Your father's land runs a full mile against Caldwell's western fence. Join the two, and you've got the largest holding this side of the James River. He doesn't want you, Eleanor. He wants the boundary line." "I'm aware," she said, "of where our fences run. Then be sensible for once in your life." His voice cracked up out of its politeness. "That land was meant to stay in the Whitmore name, our name. When your father passed with no son, that estate should have come to me. I am the nearest male of the blood, and any court in Virginia would say so, and I would have kept it whole and kept it ours. Instead, he left it to you, a girl. A spinster who'll hand it straight to a stranger the moment she signs a marriage line." He straightened, breathing hard. "You'll be the last Whitmore to ever hold it. You'll give away in one afternoon what 4 generations built. And they'll thank you for it, cousin, because at least the unwanted one finally found a use." The room went very still. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was so level it might have been reading from one of her own columns. "You've come a long way this morning to tell me I'm worthless, Thomas." "I came to tell you the truth. No." She rose from the desk now slowly, and she was not a tall woman, but something in the way she stood made him take a half step back all the same. "You came because you thought the plain unwanted Whitmore girl would be so grateful anyone spoke of her at all that she'd sign whatever you said in front of her. You've a paper in your coat this very minute, I'd wager. Something for me to put my name to. A quitclaim. A conveyance. Some sad little deed that'd put my father's land in your pocket before Judge Caldwell's ink is dry." The color left his face, and it told her everything. "You forget," she went on quieter now, which was worse, "that I've kept these books since I was 19 years old. Every acre, every rent, every debt and lease and boundary in this county passed under my pen while the men who should have done it were off drinking or dying. I know exactly what my father's land is worth, Thomas. down to the last quarter acre. And I know exactly what you're worth, too. She held his eyes. Which is why he left it to a girl. You, get out of my house. It won't be your house much longer. He backed toward the door, but he could not leave without a last blade. Men like him never could. You think Caldwell will keep you. He'll get his heir and his boundary line, and then you'll be a fixture cousin. A piece of furniture with a wedding ring. And when you're rattling around that great cold house of his with no one to talk to and no one who ever wanted you, you'll remember I told you the truth when nobody else would. He tipped his hat, the gesture an insult in itself. Good day, Mrs. Caldwell. The door shut hard behind him. Eleanor stood alone in the quiet for the space of 10 heartbeats. Then she sat back down at the desk, drew the ledger toward her, and found the exact line where she had left off. She did not cry. She had trained herself out of that long ago, back when crying had only ever earned her more of what made her cry. But her hand, she noticed, was not quite steady on the page. The lawyer came the following week. Mr. Edwin Marsh arrived at a decent hour, hat in his hands, and he waited to be received. And he took the chair he was offered, 3 small courtesies that told Eleanor more about the difference between this man and her cousin than any speech could have. She had her aunt sit in with them, old Margaret, who had come to keep house after the funeral, and who now perched by the window with her needlework and her sharp ears. Miss Whitmore, Marsh began. I'll not waste your time with pretty talk, for I don't reckon you'd thank me for it. I would not. Then I'll speak plain. He drew the folded papers from his case, but did not yet open them. Judge Nathaniel Caldwell wishes to offer you marriage. The terms are these. You would come to his estate as his wife-in-law and in name. Your father's lands would be protected under his held secure against any claim, any cousin, any court. In return, he asks for an heir, and for the ordinary running of a respectable household. He paused. There is no, that is to say, he has instructed me to be honest with you, miss, whatever it costs. He does not offer affection. He offers a contract. He believes you clever enough to see the value in it. Aunt Margaret's needle had stopped moving. Eleanor folded her hands on the desk. And what did he say of me, Mr. Marsh, when he chose me? I'd like the true words, if you please, not the softened ones. Marsh's face colored. Miss, I don't think... The true words. He looked down at his hat. He was, she saw, an honest man made miserable by his own honesty. He said, Marsh answered slowly, that he did not want a woman other men would fight over. He wanted one who'd bring no scandal, and no jealousy, and no quarrel. He forced himself to meet her eyes. He said the plain one will do. Behind Eleanor, her aunt made a sound low in her throat. But Eleanor did not flinch. She had heard worse from her own cousin that very week from every parlor in the county for 3 years. The words did not cut where the parlors expected them to cut because Eleanor had stopped keeping her worth in the place where words could reach it a long time ago. The plain one, she repeated, and something almost like the ghost of a smile touched the corner of her mouth. Well, he's not wrong about the plain. Miss Whitmore, tell me something, Mr. Marsh. She leaned forward. You handle the judge's accounts, his estate books, his rents and his ledgers, same as I handle these. I do. Have done for 11 years. Then I'll ask you plain, since we're being plain. She held his gaze. Are his books clean? The question landed somewhere Marsh had not expected it to land. His hand tightened on the brim of his hat. I beg your pardon, miss. His accounts. Do they balance? She watched him closely now, the way she watched a column of figures she didn't yet trust. A man who prices a wife like inventory keeps a careful house, I'd think. So I'd expect his books to be clean as a whistle. Are they? Of course they... Marsh stopped, and in the stopping, in the fraction of a second before a practiced man could put his answer back together, Eleanor saw it. She had spent 3 years learning to read the exact face a man made when a number would not come out right. Her cousin had made it. Her father's steward had made it before she'd caught him at it. And Edwin Marsh made it now, just for an instant, before he mastered himself. They balance, he said. Naturally. Naturally, Eleanor echoed. She let it sit. She did not press. She had learned that too, that you never chase the thing a man is hiding. You only let him know you've seen the door, and then you wait for him to keep glancing at it. How long since anyone but you looked over them, Mr. Marsh? I don't see what bearing. How long? He was quiet a moment. The judge trusts me with them entire, he said, and it was not an answer, and they both knew it was not an answer. I see, said Eleanor. And she did. That was the trouble with Eleanor Whitmore. The trouble the whole county had never quite named when they called her odd and cold and irrelevant. It was not that she felt nothing. It was that she saw everything all the time and could not stop, and it had made her lonely in a place full of people who preferred not to be seen so clearly. She sat back. Aunt Margaret was watching her now with open alarm, the way you'd watch someone lean too far over a well. You may tell Judge Caldwell, Eleanor said, that I accept his terms. Marsh's head came up. You do. I do, on one condition. A condition. He looked as though the word were foreign to him. Miss, I don't think the judge anticipated conditions. I don't reckon he anticipated much about me at all, Eleanor said mildly. That's rather the point. She rose and Marsh scrambled up out of his chair after her. My condition is this. When I come to his house as his wife, I come with the running of my father's estate still in my own two hands, not signed over, not folded into his, mine. The rents, the leases, the books, all of it stays under my pen, as it has these 3 years. He may have his heir and his quiet house and his clean boundary line, but the land answers to me. She let the words settle. Those are my terms, Mr. Marsh. Carry them back to him just as plain as he sent his to me. The attorney stared at her, and slowly something shifted behind his tired eyes. Something that was almost God, help him relief. He said you were clever, Marsh murmured. He'll not have known how clever. No, Eleanor agreed. I don't expect he will. She walked him to the door herself. And on the step, as he settled his hat and turned to go, she said one more thing so quiet that Aunt Margaret, watching from the parlor, could not hear it, and Marsh would turn it over in his mind the whole long ride home. You worry for me, Mr. Marsh. I can tell. You think you're delivering a lamb to a cold man's table. She almost smiled. But I've been managing frightened men and crooked numbers since I was a girl, and I've buried the only person who ever loved me, and not one soul in this county has wanted me for a single day of my life. There is nothing Judge Caldwell can do to me that hasn't already been done. Her eyes were very steady. So you needn't fret. It isn't the plain one who should be worried about this arrangement. She stepped back inside and closed the door on his astonished face. Then she returned to her desk. She drew the ledger toward her once more. And where any other bride in Virginia might have sat down that evening to weep or to pray or to write despairing letters to friends, she did not have Eleanor Whitmore. Instead, took a fresh sheet of paper, dipped her pen, and at the top of it wrote 3 words in her small exact hand. Caldwell. His accounts. And underneath one more line. Find out what he's hiding before he finds out what I am. Outside, the long Virginia summer pressed down over the 2 joined estates and the fence line that ran between them, and somewhere across that line, a man who thought he had made a simple, sensible, unfeeling bargain went about his evening with no notion at all that the plain one, the least, wanted the irrelevant. The one who would do had already begun to take the measure of him. She capped her ink. She banked the lamp. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had been chosen for being nothing, sat alone in the dark and began very quietly to count. The wedding was a small thing, arranged quicker than a decent county liked, and Eleanor Whitmore rode to it in her father's old carriage, with the household accounts in a leather case at her feet, because she did not trust them to any hand but her own, not even on her wedding day. Aunt Margaret sat across from her the whole way and said nothing for 3 miles. Then she said, You've brought the ledgers to your own wedding. I've brought them everywhere for 3 years, Aunt. I don't see why today should be different. Because today you're becoming a bride child, not a bookkeeper. I don't see, Eleanor said, looking out at the fence line rolling by, why a woman can't be both. Margaret pressed her lips together and let it lie. But when the carriage slowed before the great house, Caldwell's house, all pale stone and long windows and 100 rooms. Eleanor would never learn the use of the old woman reached across and took her niece's hand, and for once, Eleanor let her. "He may surprise you yet," Margaret said. "Cold men sometimes do." "I'm not counting on surprises." Eleanor gathered the leather case. "I'm counting on the contract." She met her husband at the altar and saw him full in the face for the first time in her life. Nathaniel Caldwell was younger than she'd pictured. And harder, too. A tall, spare man with the still watchfulness of someone who had spent his years judging other people and expected to be judging still. He looked at her the way a man looks at a document he has already signed with acceptance and no curiosity at all. And Eleanor, who had been looked at that way her whole life, looked right back at him the same, and something flickered behind his eyes when she did. Surprise, maybe? Brides did not usually meet his gaze. Brides usually looked at the floor. The vows were spoken. The words were said. It was over in less time than it took to shoe a horse. And that evening at the long table in the great cold dining room, husband and wife sat at opposite ends with a mile of polished oak between them and ate their first meal as strangers who had signed a paper. He did not speak until the plates were cleared. "Marsh tells me," Nathaniel said, "that you attached a condition." "I did. The management of your father's estate, held separate, under your own hand. That's the whole of it." He turned his wine glass a slow quarter turn on the cloth. "No wife in this county holds her own accounts." "No wife in this county was chosen for being the least wanted woman on a list," Eleanor said. "We're neither of us ordinary judge. I don't see the sense in pretending otherwise over supper." The glass stopped turning. Down the length of that table, Nathaniel Caldwell studied his new wife, and for the first time since Marsh had read him the names, he felt the faint cold prickle of a man who has miscalculated something and does not yet know how much. "You're direct," he said. "I'm accurate. There's a difference, though few in these parts trouble to learn it." She set down her fork. "You told your attorney to be honest with me, and I thank you for it. It's more than most men would have done. So I'll return the courtesy. I know why you married me. I know it to the acre. You wanted land that wouldn't fight you, and a wife no one else would fight you for, and you found both in the same plain package, and you thought it was tidy." She held his eyes. "I don't hold it against you. I only want you to understand that I signed for my own reasons, same as you signed for yours, and my reasons don't include disappearing into your walls, that's all." "And what are your reasons, then?" There was, for the first time, something almost like interest in his voice. Eleanor thought about the 3 words at the top of the fresh sheet in her leather case. Caldwell. His accounts. She thought about Marsh's face when she'd asked if the books were clean. "Protection of my father's land," she said. As agreed. It was not a lie. It simply was not all of the truth. And she had already learned that Nathaniel Caldwell, for all his sharpness, was a man who heard the words people said and rarely troubled with the ones they didn't. He nodded slowly, as if she'd confirmed something. "Then we understand each other." "I expect we're the only 2 people in Virginia who do." And that, though neither of them would have called it so, was the closest thing to warmth that passed between them for a long while after. The days that followed taught the household a great deal about their new mistress, and none of what they learned was what they'd braced themselves for. They had expected a mouse, a plain, frightened, grateful little spinster who would drift through the halls and trouble no one glad to be tolerated. What they got instead was a woman who was down in the estate office before the cook had the stove lit, who called for the household books on her second morning and did not give them back, who found within a week that the kitchen had been charged for 11 hams in a single month, when the family ate perhaps 2, and who summoned the housekeeper to ask about it in a voice so mild that Mrs. Doyle nearly wept from the shame of it. "I don't say you're stealing, Mrs. Doyle," Eleanor told her. "I say the number's wrong, and a wrong number is a wrong number, whether it's theft or sloppiness, and I'd sooner believe it's sloppiness. So we'll fix the counting. You'll bring the market receipts to me each Friday, and we'll set it right together, and no more will be said of it. Does that suit?" Mrs. Doyle, who had run that kitchen for 20 years and been questioned by no one, found to her own astonishment that it suited very well, and that she rather liked being spoken to, as though her honesty were assumed. She left the office standing a little straighter than she'd come in. It was so with all of them by degrees. Eleanor did not rule the house by fear the way the old judge's late mother was said to have done. She ruled it by being right quietly, relentlessly right, and by letting each person under her keep their dignity, while she corrected them. The stable found their feed accounts trued up. The steward found his boundaries firmed. Within a month, the estate ran smoother than it had in years, and the strangest part, the part the servants murmured over in the evenings, was that the new mistress never once raised her voice to make it so. Nathaniel noticed. Of course he noticed. It was his business to notice. He said nothing at first. He watched the way he watched everything from a careful distance, and he told himself that a well-run house was simply a convenience he'd purchased and ought not to marvel at. But he found, as the summer wore on, that he was inventing small reasons to pass the estate office, and that he lingered. "You've reordered the tenant leases," he said one evening, stopping in the doorway. Eleanor did not look up. "I've reordered the tenant ledger. The leases are as they were. It was only the recording that was a shambles." "They've been kept that way 30 years. "Then they've been a shambles 30 years. She turned a page. "Your tenant on the Miller tract has overpaid you 2 seasons running. Did you know that small sum? But it's his, not yours, and he's a proud man who'd never ask for it back. I've marked it to be returned at the next quarter." Nathaniel was quiet a moment. "You'd give money back." "It isn't mine to keep." She finally looked up at him, and there was a faint dry challenge in it. "Does that trouble you?" "Judge a wife who returns money." "It troubles me," he said slowly, "that no one in my employ found it in 30 years, and a woman I've known 6 weeks found it in an afternoon. I didn't find it in an afternoon. I found it in the 3rd year of doing this every single day of my life." She capped her ink. "Men are forever amazed that women can count. I've never understood it. We're the ones you trust to run your houses on the pennies you give us. You'd think you'd have noticed we were good with numbers by now." And Nathaniel Caldwell, who had not laughed aloud in longer than he could rightly recall, felt the strange, unfamiliar pull of it somewhere behind his ribs, and turned away before it could reach his face. He did not laugh. But it was a near thing, and it unsettled him more than any argument could have. She behaved, he thought, walking the dark hall back to his study, not like a bride at all, not like a wife. She behaved like a partner in a firm, like someone who owned a share of the concern and meant to see it well managed. He had married a woman to be a fixture, and found instead that he'd married a proprietor. He did not know yet whether that pleased him or alarmed him. He suspected it was both. What he did not know, what he could not have guessed, was that every hour Eleanor spent putting his household into order, she spent watching for the one thing she'd come there to find. She was patient about it. She was patient about everything. She did not go straight at the estate books, which would have been noticed. She started at the edges the way you start a knot at the loose end. The household accounts first, which were hers by right to see, and from there the tenant records, and from there casually over weeks the ledgers that touched the greater estate. She asked innocent questions. She let Marcia's clerks grow used to her presence. She made herself so ordinary a fixture in the office that no one thought twice when the mistress asked to see the older account books, the ones going back years, the ones stored in the locked cabinet. The attorney kept the key to. And one hot, still afternoon in the deep of summer, with Nathaniel away at the county court and Marsh gone with him, Eleanor found what she had known in her bones she would find. She had asked the clerk, a nervous young man named Pruitt, for the estate accounts of 8 years past. A dull request. A tidying request. He'd fetched them without a thought, and gone back to his own work. And Eleanor had sat with the great heavy book open before her, and run her pen slowly down the columns. And there in the summer, 8 years gone, she saw the first of them. A payment. Sizable. Recorded against a name she did not know for a purpose that was not named. And then, 3 months on, another. And another the season after that. Regular as rent. Careful as clockwork. Sums drawn out of the Caldwell estate and paid to a man called only H. Croft Agent, with no account of what the agency was for. She sat very still. She had seen this before. Not the exact shape of it, every crooked man does his crookedness a little differently, but the feel of it. The regularity. The blandness of the name. The way a real theft always tries to look like the most boring line on the page because the eye slides right past boredom. Her father's steward had done just the same years ago, hiding his skimming inside a monthly charge for sundry repairs, until Eleanor, 19, and grieving and sharp as a tack, had asked him one evening to show her which repairs exactly, and watched his whole face come apart. She turned the pages back further. The payments to H. Croft went back 6 years, 7, 8 further than the book in front of her reached. She turned them forward. They continued quarter after quarter right up through the most recent accounts, right up through the season of her own wedding. Someone was drawing money steadily out of Nathaniel Caldwell's estate, and had been for the better part of a decade, and the sums added came to a fortune. And the question that made the back of her neck go cold was this: did Nathaniel know? Because there were only two possibilities, and Eleanor's whole careful nature demanded she consider both. Either the judge knew of these payments, and they were legitimate, some private matter of his own she'd no business in, or he did not know, and someone very close to his accounts had been robbing him blind for 8 years while he read his ledgers and never saw it. And if it was the second, if a man as sharp as Nathaniel Caldwell had been bled for 8 years without knowing, then whoever was doing it was very, very good, and very close. Close enough to move the money and cover it and keep the one man who might catch it looking the other way. Close enough Eleanor thought that she had better be careful whose face she watched when she asked her next innocent question. She did not copy the figures then. She did not dare. She marked the pages in her memory. She had a memory for numbers, like other women had for faces closed. The great book, and carried it back to young Pruitt, with a word of thanks so mild, he never once looked up. Then she walked back to the estate office, sat down at her own desk, drew out the fresh sheet with her 3 words at the top of it, and beneath. Find out what he's hiding. She wrote a 4th line in her small, exact hand. He may not be hiding it. Someone may be hiding it from him. And under that H. Croft agent. 8 years. Find Croft. She was still looking at it when she heard the boots in the hall, and knew from the weight of them it was Nathaniel come home early and had just time to slide the sheet beneath the blotter before he filled the doorway. "You're pale," he said at once. It was maddening how little escaped him. "Are you unwell?" "The heat," Eleanor said. Nothing more. He looked at her a moment longer than the answer warranted. Then he stepped into the room, and there was something different in his manner tonight, something almost hesitant, which sat so strangely on him that she found herself watching it the way she'd watch a number that didn't belong. "I've come to ask you something," Nathaniel said, "and I find I don't know how, which is not a difficulty I'm accustomed to." "Then ask it plainly." "I've told you I prefer plain." He was quiet. Then, "There's to be a gathering, here, at the house. The county families, the Ashfords, the Bells, the Langleys, all of them. My late mother held one every summer, and it's expected the tradition continue. Now there's a mistress in the house again." His jaw tightened. "They'll come to look at you, Eleanor. I'll not pretend otherwise. They'll come to see the woman the judge married when he could have had any girl in 3 counties, and they'll come ready to find her wanting. I know how these people talk. I've heard them talk of you." He paused. "I would not blame you if you refused to be paraded." And Eleanor understood with a small internal jolt that this cold, contractual man was in his stiff, graceless, unpracticed way trying to protect her. She was so unused to it that for a moment she did not know what to do with it. "Let them come," she said. "Eleanor, let them come and let them look and let them talk." She met his eyes. "I've been the object of that talk for 3 years, Judge. It's the only conversation this county has ever had about me. I'll not hide from it in my own house, for it is my house now, isn't it? You made it so." Something hardened cool and bright in her plain face. "Let them come and find whatever they came to find. I'll not perform for them, but I'll not cower either." Nathaniel looked at her for a long moment, and something moved in his still features that she could not name. "No," he said quietly. "I don't reckon you will." He turned to go. At the door, he stopped his back to her and said the thing that would sit in Eleanor's chest for days after, turned over and over like a stone worn smooth. "They called you plain," he said. "The whole county, plain and cold and odd. I heard it 100 times before I ever wrote your name down." A pause. "I begin to think they never once looked at you at all." And then he was gone, and Eleanor sat alone in the office with her hand pressed flat over the hidden sheet beneath the blotter, and her own heart doing something inconvenient behind her ribs, and she was furious with herself for it. "Don't," she told herself sharply. "He is a man who bought you like inventory. A soft word costs him nothing, and it buys him a great deal, and you of all women know the difference between a kindness and a purchase." But she could not quite make herself believe he had said it to buy anything. That was the trouble. The gathering came 10 days later, and it brought the county to the great house in its Sunday finest, all of it primed and curious and cruel, in the polished way that country society is cruel. They came to look at her. Nathaniel had been right about that. Eleanor felt their eyes from the moment the first carriage rolled up. The quick assessing glances, the whispers behind fans, the way the mothers steered their lovely daughters past her with a pity that was really triumph. The plain one. The one he settled for. Poor thing. Look at her, no better than we always said. She wore a good dark dress and no ornament, and she stood at her husband's side and received them all with a calm that gave them nothing to feed on, and this more than any beauty was what began to unsettle them. They had come expecting to see a woman ashamed of herself. They found a woman who simply was not, and did not know what to do about it. And then Harriet Langley arrived. She came late, as such women do. So that the room would be full to see her enter, she did golden and glowing, and dressed in a shade of blue that had certainly cost more than a tenant paid in a year, with a smile so perfect it might have been drawn with a compass. The whole room turned. The whole room always turned for Harriet Langley. She was everything Eleanor was not, and everything the county prized, and she had, it was well known, expected once upon a time to be mistress of this very house herself. She crossed the floor straight to Eleanor with both hands out, and warmth pouring off her like heat off a stove, and every soul in the room leaned in to watch. "So you're the one," Harriet said, taking Eleanor's hands as though they were dear old friends. "I've heard so much. I said to Mother, I simply must meet the woman clever enough to catch our Nathaniel when the rest of us couldn't manage it in 10 years of trying." A ripple of laughter. The blade slid in so sweetly you'd hardly know you'd been cut. "You must tell me your secret." And Eleanor Whitmore, who had been managing crooked men and cruel women and impossible numbers since she was 19 years old, looked at that perfect smile and understood exactly what she was facing, and understood too, in the very same instant, with a cold, clear certainty that made her fingers go still in Harriet's warm grip, that she had heard the name Langley somewhere very recently indeed. She had heard it in a locked cabinet in a ledger 8 years deep. Not Croft, not the agent, but the Langleys. Harriet's own people. Their name had been in those pages too tangled up somewhere near the money that went missing. And Eleanor had been so fixed on Croft that she'd near passed it by. She held Harriet's eyes, and she held her own face perfectly, perfectly still. And she smiled back the plain woman's small, quiet smile, and she said in a voice as sweet and mild as the summer air, "My secret, Miss Langley, I'm afraid it's a dull one." She let her fingers slip free. "I keep very careful accounts." And she made quite sure to watch the exact moment that Harriet Langley's perfect smile went just for the space of a single heartbeat, entirely and completely cold. That single cold heartbeat told Eleanor more than an hour of conversation could have. She said nothing of it. She turned back to her guests, played the mistress of the house through the long, warm evening, and let Harriet Langley circulate and glitter and gather her admirers. And all the while, Eleanor watched her the way she watched a column that had a hidden error in it, somewhere patient, certain, unhurried. She would find the mistake. She always found the mistake. It was only ever a question of time. But that night, after the last carriage had rolled away and the house had gone quiet, Eleanor did not go to her bed. She went to the estate office, lit a single lamp, and drew out her hidden sheet. Beneath, H. Croft Agent. 8 years. Find Croft. She added one more line and she pressed the pen so hard it near tore the paper. Langley. Their name is in the Croft years. Why? She sat with it a long while. Then she banked the lamp and went to bed and lay awake until the birds started turning the numbers in the dark. In the morning, she began quietly to hunt. She could not go straight at it. She understood that better now than ever, because if the Langleys were tangled in the missing money, and Harriet Langley had once expected to be mistress of this very house, then this was no longer a matter of a crooked steward skimming hams. This was something with roots, something old and deep and dangerous, reaching back years, reaching into the oldest families in the county. And Eleanor had learned young that when a theft is that old and that clean, the thief has powerful friends, and a woman poking at it had best know exactly where every one of those friends stood before she said a single word aloud. So she was careful. She was patient. She asked Pruitt over the course of a fortnight for older and older account books, always with a dull tidying reason. And she read them in the quiet afternoons when the men were at court, and she pieced the thing together, one boring line at a time. And what she pieced together turned her cold. The payments to H. Croft had begun 8 years back that she'd known. What she had not known was what else began that same summer. That was the summer the older books showed that Nathaniel Caldwell's father had died. The old judge. The one who'd built the estate and held the county in his fist for 40 years. He'd died sudden of an apoplexy, and his son Nathaniel Young, then newly a judge himself, had come into the whole of it at once. And in that same season, the season the old man died and the son inherited the payments to Croft, had begun. Not before, not gradually. All at once, the very quarter the estate changed hands. Someone had waited for the old judge to die. Eleanor sat with that a long time. Because the old judge, everyone agreed, had been a terror over his own accounts, a suspicious, tight-fisted, sharp-eyed old man who'd trust no one with a penny and check every line himself. No thief could have moved a dollar past him. But his son, his cold, clever, trusting son, who read his ledgers but relied on his attorney, who prided himself on judgment, but delegated the tedious work of watching his son, was another matter entirely. The thief had not been able to steal from the father, so the thief had waited for the father to die, which meant the theft was not old habit. It was a plan. Someone had known 8 years ago that when the old judge died, the accounts would pass into hands that could be worked, and someone had been ready. Eleanor's pen hovered over the sheet. Who had known the old man was dying? Who was close enough to the estate to move money the moment it changed hands? Who had the standing to make a fortune vanish quarter by quarter for 8 years and never once be questioned? There was only one name that answered all three. And it was not Croft, who was surely just the mouth of the funnel, the agent, the hand that received. It was the man who had held the key to the locked cabinet for 11 years. The man who read Nathaniel his lists and drew up his contracts and kept his books. The one man in the county whom Nathaniel Caldwell trusted entire. Edwin Marsh. Eleanor set down her pen and pressed both hands flat against the desk and made herself breathe. Because Marsh had been kind to her. Marsh had brought his hat in his hands and taken the chair he was offered, and told her the ugly truth when he could have softened it. Marsh had looked miserable at his own honesty. Marsh had murmured, "He'll not have known how clever," with something like relief in his tired eyes, as though he were actually glad that the plain woman had teeth. And that Eleanor thought that was exactly the trouble. That was exactly what a man who'd stolen a fortune for 8 years would do. He would be kind. He would be honest about the small things, so no one troubled to check him on the large ones. He would look tired and decent and pained by his own good conscience, and he would be all the while the smiling face over the deepest hole in the ledger. Or, said the stubborn, accurate part of her that refused to let a single number lie unexamined, or he is exactly the decent man he appears, and you are about to accuse an innocent man to his employer and destroy him on the strength of a name near some money in a book. She did not know. That was the honest truth of it. She had a shape, but not a proof. She had the smell of the thing, but not the thing itself. And Eleanor Whitmore had one iron rule learned at 19 over her father's crooked steward. You never ever say the accusation aloud until you can lay the proof on the table. Because an accusation without proof only warns the thief, and a warned thief covers his tracks, and then the money is gone, and the reputation is ruined, and you have nothing left but a mess and an enemy. She needed the proof. She needed Croft. So she did the one thing she had been avoiding. She went to find out who H. Croft actually was. It was not simple. A woman could not exactly ride into the county seat asking after a strange man's business. But a woman could send a letter to a cousin she despised if she was clever about the wording, and Eleanor had a cousin who despised her right back and who knew every deed and title and shady dealing in the district because he was forever trying to get his hands on land Thomas. She wrote to Thomas. She wrote him a careful, cold little letter that gave nothing away, in which she asked as if idly as if it were an estate matter of the dullest kind, whether he knew of a man named H. Croft, who acted as agent in property matters, as she'd come across the name in some old Whitmore papers, and wished to settle an ancient account. Thomas wrote back within the week, and his letter was gloating and hateful and exactly as useful as she'd hoped. "Come begging to me now, are you, cousin?" he wrote. "Now that you've married your cold judge and found the great house isn't so warm as you thought, I know Croft. Everyone who deals in land knows Croft. He's no honest agent whatever your old Whitmore papers pretend he's a fixer, a man who moves money quiet for folk who don't want their names on things. If Croft's in your papers, then somebody in your family was hiding something, and I'd not go pulling that thread if I were you, but you never did have the sense to leave a thing alone." And then, at the very bottom, almost as an afterthought, the line that made Eleanor's blood go still. "Last I heard, Croft did most of his business through the Langley house. Thick as thieves with old man Langley for years. Ask Harriet if you dare. Though I doubt she'd tell you, seeing as it was her father who kept Croft on the payroll." Eleanor read it 3 times. Croft worked for the Langleys. Not for Marsh, not for the estate. For the Langleys. She had been wrong. She sat back in her chair and felt the whole shape of the thing turn over and rearrange itself the way it does when you find the one number you'd misread, and suddenly every column falls a different way. Not Marsh skimming quietly for himself. Not a lone, crooked attorney. Something bigger and colder and older. The Langley family, one of the oldest and proudest in the county, moving money out of the Caldwell estate through their own paid fixer for 8 years, ever since the old judge died, and left everything to a son who trusted the wrong people. But why? Why would the Langleys, rich in their own right, bleed the Caldwell estate? What was worth 8 years of careful, dangerous theft? And then Eleanor thought of Harriet's face. Harriet, who had expected to be mistress of this house. Harriet, who had come to the gathering golden and glowing and furious under the gold, and who had gone cold as a grave the instant a plain woman mentioned careful accounts. And Eleanor understood. It had never been only about money. She rose, and she went to find the one set of documents she had not yet dared to touch, the papers of the marriage settlement itself. The estate entailed the terms of inheritance that governed who got the Caldwell land and under what conditions. Marsh kept them. Marsh kept everything. But Eleanor was mistress of the house now, and there were keys a mistress could ask for, that a bookkeeper could not, and she asked for them the next morning in her mildest voice, and Mrs. Doyle, who would have walked through fire for her by now, fetched them without a question. Eleanor spent that whole long afternoon alone with the inheritance papers, and by the time the light was failing, she had found it and her hands were shaking, and she understood at last exactly what she had married into. The Caldwell estate was held under an old entail, a legal knot tied by Nathaniel's grandfather to keep the land whole. And that entail had a clause. If Nathaniel Caldwell died without a legitimate heir, the whole of the estate, the land, the house, all of it, would not pass to a Caldwell cousin, as most such things did. It would pass by an old marriage alliance made 2 generations back and never undone to the next family in the line of succession. The Langleys. If Nathaniel died childless, the Langleys got everything. Eleanor set the paper down very carefully as though it might go off. 8 years ago, the old judge died and left everything to a son with no wife and no heir. And in that same season, the Langleys began quietly bleeding the estate through Croft. Not to ruin it, she saw now, but to manage it, to keep it in a state they controlled, to make themselves indispensable creditors to be ready. Because as long as Nathaniel Caldwell had no legitimate child, the whole fortune was one death away from being theirs by right. They had been playing a long game, a patient, cold, generational game, waiting for a childless judge to die. And then this summer, Nathaniel had done the one thing that could ruin all of it. He had married. He had married a woman precisely so that he might get a legitimate heir, an heir who would break the entail, who would keep the estate out of Langley hands forever, who would make 8 years of patient theft and waiting come to nothing. No wonder Harriet had gone cold. No wonder she'd come to the gathering to inspect the woman who'd caught the judge. Eleanor was not a rival for Nathaniel's affection. Eleanor was the woman whose future child would cost the Langleys an entire estate. Eleanor was from the Langley point of view a problem to be solved. She sat in the dark office with that thought and felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something colder and older than fear. Because if the Langleys had been willing to wait 8 years and steal a fortune for the chance at that estate if they had, and Eleanor was more and more certain they had been ready for the old judge to die at exactly the right moment. Then the old judge's sudden convenient apoplexy in exactly the season, the thief needed him gone, began to look like something other than God's own timing. And if they had done that to the father, what would they do to the son's new wife the moment they understood she carried the one thing that could end their whole design? The thought was still cold in her chest when the door opened and Nathaniel came in and took one look at her face in the low light and stopped dead. Eleanor. He crossed the room in 3 strides, and there was nothing cold in him now, nothing contractual, only a sharp animal alarm she'd never seen on him before. What's happened? You look as though you've seen the dead. She looked up at him. Her husband. The cold man who'd bought her like inventory. The man who'd said they never once looked at you at all and made her heart do inconvenient things. The man who did not know she was suddenly wrenchingly certain. He did not know that he had married her straight into the sights of the people who had likely killed his father and meant to inherit everything he owned. And Eleanor made a decision in that instant that changed everything between them. She did not tell him, not yet. Because she had no proof she had a shape, a smell, a terrible logic, but not one thing she could lay on a table. And Nathaniel Caldwell was a judge. He lived by proof. If she came to him now with an accusation against the oldest family in the county, an accusation that touched his own father's death, with nothing but a name in a ledger and a cousin's spiteful letter to back it, he would not believe her. Worse, he might out of duty or honor or sheer disbelief go straight to the Langleys to clear the matter up. And the moment the Langleys knew that Nathaniel Caldwell's clever bookkeeping wife had begun pulling at the thread, they would cut the thread and her with it. No. She would get her proof first. She would build the case the way she built everything, quietly, completely, one true line at a time until it was airtight and undeniable and could not be waved away. And only then would she put it in front of him. Nothing's happened, she said, and made her face go smooth. The heat and a long day with dull papers. I frightened myself over nothing. She rose and gathered the inheritance documents together, casual as anything. I was reading the old settlement. Curiosity. I like to understand a thing entire. Nathaniel looked at her a long moment, and she saw him not believe her, and saw him decide not to press it, and did not know which unsettled her more. You'd tell me, he said slowly, if something were wrong. It was not quite a question. Of course. Eleanor lied and hated herself a little for how easily it came. He held her eyes another beat. Then he nodded, and something in the set of his shoulders eased, and he said in a voice gone unexpectedly rough, Good, because I find... He stopped, started again awkward as a boy. I find I've grown used to knowing you're here, in the office, with your books. I hadn't reckoned on that, when I made the arrangement. He looked away. That's all. And then he left quick, before either of them could make anything more of it. Eleanor stood alone, with the deadly papers in her arms, and her husband's clumsy confession ringing in her ears, and understood with a sinking clarity that she had a far worse problem now than she'd had an hour ago. An hour ago, she had merely married into danger. Now, she was beginning to care whether the man in the danger lived. The proof came the way proof always came to Eleanor, not in a lightning stroke, but in patience. She spent the following weeks assembling it. She matched the Croft payments quarter by quarter against the estate's true income and showed the theft plain in her own hand. She traced the entail and the succession and laid out in cold ink exactly what the Langleys stood to gain. She wrote to a lawyer in Richmond, not Marsh. Never Marsh, a stranger with no county loyalties, and asked as a hypothetical what the law said about a death that enabled a fraud, and got back a careful answer that made her feel ill. And slowly, line by line, the case became a thing she could hold. But she needed one thing more. She needed to tie Croft to the Langleys with something no one could deny: a document, a signature, a letter in Harriet's own family's hand. And to get it, she was going to have to do the most dangerous thing yet. She was going to have to let Harriet Langley believe she'd won. The opportunity came at the second gathering, a smaller supper, and Harriet came again. Of course she came. She could not stay away from the woman she needed to measure, and this time Eleanor played it differently. This time she was quiet, deferential, a little dim, even prattling mildly about the difficulty of running so great a house, about how she feared she wasn't clever enough for it after all, about how Judge Caldwell was so very busy and so very cold, and how lonely a plain wife could be in such a place. And she watched Harriet Langley's beautiful eyes light with a slow satisfaction, watched her decide that the plain one was no threat after all, just a dull, frightened little bookkeeper in over her head, and watched her grow careless. "You poor thing," Harriet purred, drawing Eleanor aside, warm as sunshine. "You know, if it's ever too much, the accounts, the estate, all of it, my family has such experience with these old holdings. We've helped the Caldwells before, you know, in trying times. My father and old Judge Caldwell were the very closest of friends." A slow, sweet smile. "We look after our own in this county. You've only to ask." "You're too kind," Eleanor murmured, eyes down, meek as milk. "I confess I don't understand the half of it. There are these old payments I can't make sense of. Some agent to Mr. Croft. I've half a mind to write and ask him myself, only I shouldn't know how to begin." She felt rather than saw the exact instant the warmth went out of Harriet Langley. "Croft," Harriet repeated. "You'd not know him, I'm sure." Eleanor said, all innocence. "Only his name's on so many of the old accounts and no one seems to—" "I wouldn't write to Mr. Croft," Harriet said. Her voice had gone very light and very careful, the voice of someone stepping around a snake. "He's not a reliable man. Old business. Best left alone." The perfect smile was back, but it did not reach her eyes now, and her eyes were fixed on Eleanor with a new and terrible attention. "You're sweet to worry over such things, but truly, my dear, some old accounts are better closed than opened. A woman in your position, new to the house, no family of your own to speak of, no real friends in the county, she does best not to go poking into what she can't understand. It can be dangerous, you know." The smile widened. "Getting things wrong. In a strange house. Among people you don't know." And there it was. Not a proof, but a threat plain as day, spoken sweet as sugar, and Eleanor, meek and mild and eyes down, had drawn it straight out of her. Harriet Langley knew who Croft was. Harriet Langley did not want him written to. Harriet Langley had just, in her sweet, careful, poisonous voice, warned a woman with no family and no friends that it could be dangerous to go poking into things, in almost exactly the tone of a woman who knew from experience precisely how dangerous and precisely who had made it so. Eleanor lowered her eyes and let Harriet see her flinch, let her enjoy it, let her walk away, certain she'd frightened the plain little bookkeeper back into her place. Then Eleanor Whitmore went home and sat down at her desk and drew out the sheet, and beneath everything else she had written, she wrote the last line, and this time her hand did not shake at all. "She knows. She threatened me. Now I know she knows. Get Croft's papers. End it." She had her shape. She had her logic. She had now a frightened enemy who'd shown her hand. All that was left was the proof itself. Croft's own records, the one thing that would turn suspicion into certainty and let her lay the whole rotten business at her husband's feet. She did not yet know how she would get it. She only knew, sitting alone in the lamplight, with the whole deadly design at last laid out plain before her, that the plain, unwanted, irrelevant Whitmore girl, the one who would do, had just become the single most dangerous person in the county, to a family that had killed once already, to get what it wanted. And that whatever happened next, there was no longer any turning back. She got Croft's papers through the one door no one had thought to guard. She got them through Marsh. It shamed her how she did it, because Marsh was the one man in that whole rotten business who had been decent to her, and she had suspected him. And now she meant to use his very decency against him. But Eleanor had learned long ago that a woman with no power uses whatever the world hands her, and the world had handed her a tired, honest attorney who kept every scrap of paper he had ever touched. She went to him plain. She did not lie to Marsh. She had lied enough that summer, and it sat ill on her. She went to his office in the county seat on a market day alone, and she shut the door, and she said, "Mr. Marsh, I'm going to ask you something, and I need you to think very hard before you answer, because a great deal depends on it." He set down his pen. "Miss Whitmore, Mrs. Caldwell, you've a face on you like a funeral." "I've reason to." She sat. She laid her folded hands on his desk. "I need to see everything you have touching a man named H. Croft. Every payment, every letter, every scrap. And before you tell me the judge trusts you with his accounts entire, I know he does. That's precisely why I've come to you, and not to him." The color went slowly out of Edwin Marsh's face, and Eleanor watched it go, and knew in that moment the thing she had half hoped and half dreaded. He knew the name. "Where did you hear that name?" Marsh said, very quiet. "In your own account books. 8 years of them." She held his eyes. "Payments to H. Croft, agent, quarter on quarter, no purpose named, beginning the very season old Judge Caldwell died. I've matched every one. I can lay them out for you line by line if you doubt me." She leaned forward. "Now I'll ask you plain, Mr. Marsh, the way you once had the decency to ask me plain. Did you steal that money?" And Edwin Marsh put his face in his hands. For a long moment, he did not speak. When he lowered his hands, his eyes were wet and old, and something in them had broken clean through, and Eleanor understood that she had been wrong about the shape of his guilt, not wrong that there was guilt, but wrong about its kind. "No," Marsh said. "God help me. No, I didn't steal it. But I've watched it be stolen for 8 years, and I've said nothing, and before God that's near as black." The whole room seemed to go still around the two of them. "Tell me," Eleanor said. And he told her. He told her how the payments had started the very week the old judge died, drawn on the estate by authority Marsh himself had never signed, how he'd questioned the first one, and been visited that same night by 2 men from the Langley house, who had not threatened him in words, but had asked very pleasantly after his daughter in Richmond and his sister's family, and named the schoolhouse his grandchildren attended, and left him understanding entire. He told her how he'd gone once, only once, to the young Judge Caldwell, to hint at irregularities, and how Nathaniel, grieving, newly burdened, trusting the man his father had trusted, had waved it off as the confusion of a hard season, and how the Langleys had known of that visit before Marsh's horse was back in its stall, and had made very clear again pleasantly that a second visit would be his last of anything. "So I kept the books," Marsh said, and his voice cracked. "I kept them careful and clean, and I let a fortune bleed out of that man's estate year on year, and I told myself I was protecting my family, and maybe I was. But I've not slept a whole night in 8 years, Mrs. Caldwell. I've watched that boy, for he was a boy when it started, grow into a cold, hard, suspicious man who trusts near no one, and I've known it was because everyone around him was lying to him, myself worst of all, and I could not find the courage to—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together hard. "And then he married you. And I thought when I read him that list, I thought there's a woman who keeps her own books. There's a woman who might see. And God forgive me. Mrs. Caldwell, I put your name on that page, and I prayed you were sharp enough to catch what I hadn't the spine to say aloud." Eleanor sat very still. "You wanted me to find it," she said slowly. "That's why you didn't fight my condition. The estate in my own hands, my own eyes on the books." "I hoped," Marsh whispered. "I only hoped." And the last suspicion Eleanor had carried, the cold, careful part of her, that had refused to trust even this broken, decent man, went quiet at last. He had not been the smiling face over the whole. He had been a coward, yes. A frightened man who'd chosen his own grandchildren over another man's fortune. But he had also, in the only way a coward can try to save them all by finding a woman brave enough to do the thing he could not. "Then help me now," Eleanor said. "Give me the proof. Croft's papers. Whatever you have. Give me enough to lay before a court that isn't in this county's pocket, and I swear to you, Mr. Marsh, I'll keep your name out of it every way I can. They'll kill you." He said it flat. No drama. Just a man stating a thing he'd learned the hard way. "You understand that. You're not a frightened old lawyer they can hold by his grandchildren. You're a woman with no family and no friends who's about to become the mother of the heir that ruins their whole design. To them, you're already dead, Mrs. Caldwell. You're just still walking." "I know exactly what I am to them." Eleanor rose. "That's why I can't afford to be slow. Get me the papers." He got her the papers. It took him 4 days working at night copying what he dared not remove, and stealing what he dared not copy. And when he brought her the packet wrapped in oilcloth tied with plain string, met at the estate gate before dawn. Like a thing of shame, his hands shook, so that he could barely pass it over. "It's all there," he said. "The authorizations, Croft's receipts, 2 letters in the elder Langley's own hand instructing the payments." He swallowed. "And one more thing. The thing I never let myself look at square until you made me go digging." He held her eyes in the gray light. "The physician who signed off the old judge's death. He was paid Mrs. Caldwell. Paid by Croft. 3 days after the funeral. It's in the receipts." Eleanor's breath went out of her slow. "An apoplexy," she said. "That's what the paper says. But a healthy man of 60, who checked his own accounts every morning of his life, dropped dead. The one season it was convenient he should, and the man who signed the paper took Langley money for it." Marsh's voice was barely there. "I'm not saying I know. I'm saying I never let myself ask. And I think you're going to ask. And I think it's going to cost you everything." He was right about that. Eleanor took the packet inside, and she read it through by lamplight every page, and by the time the sun was properly up, she had it whole in her mind. The theft, the entail the physician, the 8 patient years, the whole cold generational machine of it. She had her proof. Not a shape now, not a smell. Proof in ink in the Langley's own hands, enough to hang a case on in any honest court in Virginia. And she made her plan. She would go to Richmond. She would take the packet to the stranger lawyer who owed the county nothing, and she would set the whole thing in motion where the Langleys could not reach to smother it. And only then, only when it was safe, only when it could not be waved away, would she tell Nathaniel everything. She never got the chance, because Harriet Langley was not a fool whatever Eleanor had let her believe. Harriet had been watching too, and a lawyer working 4 nights running an estate gate opened before dawn. A packet passed hand to hand. The Langleys had eyes in this county that Eleanor was only beginning to understand, and they saw enough. They moved first. They did not come with men in the night, as Marsh had feared. They were far cleverer than that. They came instead with a rider to the county court and a whispered word to the right ears, and by the time Eleanor sat down to breakfast on the morning she meant to leave for Richmond, there were 2 officers of the county at the door of Caldwell House, and a warrant and a charge. The charge was against Eleanor. Theft. Fraud. The falsification of estate accounts. It was laid out neat and sworn to by men of standing that the new Mrs. Caldwell, a woman of no family, who had married her way into a great estate and demanded sole control of its books as a condition of the marriage. A most irregular and suspicious demand had been discovered systematically altering those books and drawing money from the estate for her own purposes. That the discrepancies went back why the better part of a decade, though, of course she'd only had her hands on the accounts a few months, but a clever woman could backdate, could she not? Could forge an old hand. And here were the very ledgers in her possession, in her own house, altered in her own ink. They had turned it around. The 8 years of Langley theft, the whole rotten trail Eleanor had spent a summer uncovering, they had hung the entire thing around her neck. Who had demanded control of the books the moment she entered the house, Eleanor? Who had been seen prying into old accounts, questioning clerks, writing to strange lawyers in Richmond, Eleanor? Who had a packet of stolen estate papers wrapped in oilcloth hidden in her very rooms at this moment, Eleanor. They had built her a gallows out of her own investigation. And the cruelest stroke. The one that told her Harriet's hand was in every line of it. The charge painted her exactly as the county had always seen her. The cold, odd, grasping spinster no man had wanted, who'd finally schemed her way into a rich man's house and set about robbing him. It was a story the whole county was primed to believe, because it was the story they'd been telling about her for 3 years. The plain one. The clever, cold, unnatural one. Of course she'd turned out a thief. Hadn't they always said there was something wrong with her? Nathaniel came into the breakfast room while the officers stood there, and he took in the scene, his wife. The warrant. The grim men and Eleanor watched his face, and it was the single worst moment of the whole terrible summer. Because she saw him doubt her, just for an instant, just a flicker. But it was there the reflex of a man who had been lied to and stolen from by everyone he'd ever trusted, whose whole cold, armored life was built on the certainty that people were underneath it all, out for what they could get. He had married a woman who demanded sole control of his accounts. He'd found her strange from the start, too clever, too watchful. And here were sworn men with a warrant and ledgers in her own ink. For one instant, the whole cold logic of his nature turned against her, and Eleanor saw in her husband's eyes the terrible question, "Did I bring a thief into my house?" And that instant broke something in her that 8 years of the county's cruelty never had. "They'll show you the books," Eleanor said. Her voice was steady. It cost her everything to keep it steady. "The altered ones. And you'll look at my hand in them, and you'll think it's proof. And I can't stop you thinking it, Nathaniel. I've no time to walk you through 8 years of ledgers with 2 officers at my elbow." She stood. She did not reach for him. She had never been one to reach. "So I'll only ask you one thing, and then you may believe what you like. When did the thefts begin? Not when did I come to this house. When did the money start bleeding out? Ask them that. Ask them to show you the date of the very first false payment." She held his eyes. "And then ask yourself who was in this county 8 years ago drawing on your estate, because it surely wasn't me. I was a girl of 16 keeping my father's hens." The officers shifted. One of them started to speak. "The date," Eleanor said, not loudly, but in a voice that cut clean across the room, the voice of a woman who had spent her life being right and being ignored and would be ignored no longer. "Nathaniel, make them show you the date." And Nathaniel Caldwell, Judge Coldman husband, looked at his wife and looked at the officers, and something in him steadied. The doubt did not vanish, but it stopped. It held. Because whatever else he was a man who had spent his life demanding proof, and his wife had just in the worst hour of her life demanded it too. A guilty woman begged. A guilty woman wept and swore and clung. His wife had asked him to check a date. "Let me see the ledgers," Nathaniel said. "Judge Caldwell, the warrant sworn we've no authority to. I am a judge of this county." His voice dropped into something that had frozen better men than these two. "And that is my estate's ledger in your hand, and my wife in my house, and you will show me the first entry before you take one step toward that door, or I will know the reason why, and so will everyone I answer to in Richmond." He held out his hand. "The ledger." They gave him the ledger. He found the first false payment. He looked at the date, and Eleanor watched her husband go absolutely still, the way she went still over a number that told an ugly truth. And she knew he had seen it the season of his father's death, 8 years gone, when his wife had been a child on another man's farm. "This entry is dated the summer my father died," Nathaniel said slowly. "A backdating, Your Honor. A forgery. The woman's clever. She was 16 years old and living 40 miles from here." Nathaniel's voice was very quiet now, and very cold, and it was not aimed at Eleanor anymore. "Whose authority drew this payment? It's not my signature. It's not my father's. Whose is it?" He turned the page, turned another. "There's a name recurs on all of these. An agent. Croft." He looked up, and his eyes found Eleanor's across the room, and in them was a dawning, terrible understanding. "You knew," he said. "This is what you've been doing all summer, in the office, With your books. His voice caught. You weren't stealing from me. You were finding out who'd been stealing from me for 8 years. And you didn't tell me. I couldn't, Eleanor said. Not without proof. You'd not have believed the shape of it. I scarcely believed it myself. And the moment you knew, you'd have gone to them because they're the oldest family in the county. And you're an honest man. And honest men always think they can settle a thing by asking it straight. Her composure cracked just once, just at the edges. And they'd have killed me for it, Nathaniel. The way I think, the way I've come to think, they killed your father. The room went utterly silent. The two officers stood frozen. And Nathaniel Caldwell, who had not wept at his own father's funeral 8 years gone, who had turned to stone that season and stayed stone ever since, looked at his wife across the ruin of their breakfast table and said in a voice that had come entirely undone, "What did you say about my father?" And Eleanor, because there was no turning back now, because the papers were hidden in her room and the officers were at the door. And the truth was, the only weapon she had left told him. All of it. The entail that gave everything to the Langleys if he died childless. The 8 years of patient theft while they waited. The physician paid 3 days after the funeral. And the reason it had all come to a head this summer. The reason Harriet had gone cold at a garden party. The reason the Langleys had moved now fast and vicious to destroy the plain, unwanted wife they'd never once feared. They waited 8 years for you to die childless so they could inherit? Eleanor said. And then you married me. And I'm the one thing that ends it, because the moment you and I have a child, the estate's out of their reach forever, and 8 years of murder and theft come to nothing. She was shaking now, and she let it show because there was no strength left to hide it. That's why they've done this. Not to steal from you. To be rid of me before I can give you an heir. They mean to see me hang Nathaniel or transported or locked away, anything that ends this marriage before it can produce the child that ruins them. That's the whole of it. That's what your books have been screaming at you for 8 years while everyone you trusted kept you from hearing it. For a long, long moment, Nathaniel Caldwell said nothing at all. Then he turned to the two officers, and when he spoke, his voice was the voice of the coldest judge in Virginia, and it did not shake at all. You will leave my house, he said. You will take your warrant back to whoever swore it, and you will tell them that Judge Nathaniel Caldwell has examined the evidence himself and finds it not merely wanting, but fabricated, and that he intends to inquire personally and to the fullest extent the law of this Commonwealth allows into who has been drawing 8 years of unauthorized payments from his estate through an agent named Croft, and into the circumstances of his father's death. He took one step toward them. And you will tell Harriet Langley, for we both know whose hand is behind this, that she has made one mistake this morning that she cannot take back. His voice dropped to almost nothing. She has finally made me look at my own books. Now get out. They got out. And when the door had shut and the sound of the horses had faded, Nathaniel Caldwell turned to his wife, the plain one the least wanted. The one who would do, who had spent a summer quietly saving his fortune and his name, and possibly his life, while he watched her from doorways, and told himself he'd purchased a convenience, and he crossed the room to her at last, and he did not touch her, because he did not yet know how, but he stood before her closer than he ever had, and he said the words that no ledger could ever balance, and no contract could ever contain. I owe you an apology, Nathaniel said. I owe you more than I know how to say. I chose you because I thought you were nothing. I told a room full of people that the plain one would do. His voice broke. And you are the only person in 8 years who ever tried to save me. Not one soul who admired me. Not one who wanted me. You. The one I said would do. He shook his head slowly, and there was wonder in it, and grief, and something else he did not yet have a name for. They never once looked at you at all, Eleanor. And neither, God forgive me, did I. Until now. She got Croft's papers through the one door no one had thought to guard. She got them through Marsh, and she got them by being wrong about him, and finding out how wrong in the space of a single conversation that changed everything. It shamed her the way she went at it, because Marsh might be the one man in that whole rotten business who had ever been decent to her, and she still could not be sure he wasn't the Langleys' creature to the bone. and she meant to use his very decency as a lever, whichever he turned out to be. But Eleanor had learned long ago that a woman with no power uses whatever the world puts in her hand. And the world had put in her hand a tired lawyer who copied accounts by night and rode them to a dead man's house, and a memory of that same lawyer murmuring, "He'll not have known how clever," with something like hope in his eyes. She went to him plain. She would not lie to Marsh. She had lied enough that summer to Harriet to Nathaniel, and it sat ill on her, and she had a notion that with this particular man, the truth would cut deeper than any trick. She went to his office in the county seat on a market day alone, and she shut the door behind her, and she sat down across from him and said, "Mr. Marsh, I'm going to say a name, and I'm going to watch your face when I say it, and I'll thank you not to bother arranging your features, because I've spent 3 years learning to read exactly the face a man makes when a number won't come right, and you'll not manage a look I haven't already seen." He set down his pen. "Mrs. Caldwell, you've a way of opening a conversation." "Croft," Eleanor said, and she watched him. She had expected one of two faces. The face of a guilty man caught the quick blankness, the reach for a story. Or the face of an innocent one baffled the honest furrow the who. What she got was neither. What she got was the face of a man who had been waiting 8 years for someone to say that name to him, and was almost, God help him, grateful to hear it at last. Edwin Marsh put his face in his hands. For a long moment he did not speak. When he lowered his hands, his eyes were wet and old, and something in them had broken clean through, and Eleanor understood in that instant that she had been wrong about the shape of his guilt. Not wrong that there was guilt, but wrong about its kind entirely. "You found it," he said. "Dear God, you actually found it. I put your name on that list and I prayed, and I told myself it was a fool's prayer, and you a summer. It took you a summer." He laughed, and there was no humor in it, only something like release. 40 years that estate ran, and no one saw it. I gave it to you in a locked cabinet, and a clerk's gossip, and the faith that you were sharper than any of them ever guessed, and you saw it in a summer. Eleanor did not move. "Say it plain, Mr. Marsh. I need it plain. Did you steal that money?" "No." He met her eyes, and there was no flinch in it. "Before God, no. I never took a dollar of it. But I have watched it be stolen for 8 years, and I have kept the books clean, so that the theft would not show, and I have said nothing to the one man I owed everything to, and before God, Mrs. Caldwell, that is near as black as stealing it myself, and I have not slept a whole night through in 8 years knowing it." The whole room seemed to go still around the two of them. "Then tell me," Eleanor said, "all of it, from the beginning, and Mr. Marsh, I'll know if you shade it. I always know." And he told her. He told her how the payments had begun the very week the old judge died, drawn on the estate by an authority Marsh himself had never signed, appearing in the books, as if they'd been waiting for the old man's heart to stop. He told her how he'd questioned the very first one gone to raise it, and how he'd been visited that same night before he'd told a living soul, by 2 men from the Langley house. They had not threatened him in words. They had sat in his parlor and drunk his brandy and asked very pleasantly after his daughter in Richmond, after his sister's family. They had named with terrible gentleness the schoolhouse his grandchildren attended, and the road they walked to reach it, and the hour. And then they had wished him a good evening and gone, and Edwin Marsh had understood entire. "They knew I'd questioned it before I'd finished questioning it," Marsh said. "That's what broke me, Mrs. Caldwell. Not the threat, the speed of it. I'd told no one, and they were in my parlor by nightfall, which meant they had ears in my own office. My own house meant there was no move I could make, no letter I could write, no word I could whisper that wouldn't be at the Langley house before my ink was dry." His hands trembled on the desk. "How do you fight a thing that hears you think I couldn't? I was one tired old man with grandchildren on a road, and they were the oldest family in the county, with a fixer who moved money like water, and men who smiled while they named your grandchildren's schoolhouse. So I did the coward's thing. I kept the books. I kept them beautiful. And I watched a fortune bleed out of that boy's estate year on year, and told myself I was protecting my family, and maybe I was, and it was still the worst thing I ever did." "You went to Nathaniel," Eleanor said. Once, didn't you? Early? Marsh's head came up sharp. How could you? Because he told me. He didn't know he was telling me. He said you'd hinted at irregularities that first hard year, and he'd waved it off as the confusion of a grieving season. She watched him. He thinks he ignored an honest man's honest warning. He's carried that too without knowing what he carried. I went to him once. Marsh's voice cracked. Hinted, half hinted I hadn't the spine to say it whole, and he was young and grieving and buried in it, and he waved me off, and I let him God forgive me. And do you know what happened next? He leaned forward. The Langleys knew of that visit before my horse was back in its stall. And 2 men came to my parlor a second time. And this time they didn't ask after my grandchildren. This time they told me that a second visit to the judge would be my last visit to anywhere. And I believed them. I believed them because 3 months before, a hale old man had checked his books at dawn and been dead by dark. And I'd signed the estate over to his grieving son the very next week, and I had begun to understand Mrs. Caldwell exactly what kind of family I had made myself the servant of. Eleanor's breath went out of her slow. There it was from another mouth unprompted. You think they killed him, she said. The old judge, I think, Marsh said very quietly. That a man who had begun writing to Richmond about cutting the Langleys out of the succession dropped dead. The one season it was convenient to them that he should, and I think the physician who signed the death was a Langley man. And I think I have spent 8 years being very, very careful never to finish that thought, because a man who finishes that thought out loud in this county does not live to think another. He pressed his lips together. But you've come and said the name to my face, and I find I'm too old and too tired and too ashamed to go on not finishing it. Yes, I think they killed him. I think they killed him to keep that estate on its path to their hands, and I think they've been keeping it on that path for 8 years through me, and I think the only thing that ever truly threatened their whole design was Nathaniel marrying, Eleanor said, and getting an heir. Was Nathaniel marrying, Marsh agreed, which is why, and here his voice dropped so low she had to lean to catch it. Which is why I did the one brave thing I have done in 8 years, and I have been sick with it ever since, because I don't know if it was brave or if it was murder. Eleanor went very still. What did you do, Mr. Marsh, when he told me it was time, that he'd marry for an heir to secure the line? Marsh's eyes were fixed on her pleading now. The Langleys expected me to steer him. They'd made it plain over the years if ever the judge spoke of marrying, I was to guide him toward delay, toward a girl of theirs, toward anything that wouldn't produce a true heir to break the entail. That was my standing order, and I sat there with the list in my hand and 4 wanted pliable, manageable girls on it, any one of whom the Langleys could have worked or delayed or frightened or married off elsewhere in a season, and I... He stopped, swallowed. And I put your name at the bottom of that page, because I'd heard of you. The plain Whitmore girl who kept her own father's books and caught her own father's crooked steward at 19. The cold, clever one nobody wanted. And I thought she's the one they'll never see coming. She's the one who might see the books. She's the one who won't be steered or frightened or bought. And I read the judge that list, and I dismissed the 4 they'd have approved of one by one, and I let his own cold logic land him on the only name that could destroy them. Marsh was shaking. I aimed you at them, Mrs. Caldwell, like a pistol, without your knowing. I put a woman I'd never met into the path of the people who killed my master's father, and I prayed you were sharp enough to survive it and win. And I have not slept since, because if they kill you, the way they killed him, then I loaded the gun and pointed it, and it will have been me that did it. The silence in that little office was total. And Eleanor Whitmore sat with the whole of it, the theft, the threats, the murdered father, the frightened lawyer, and now this. The discovery that her own marriage, her own place in this house had been engineered by a desperate old man as a last blind throw against a family that hears men think. And she found that she was not angry. She had expected, if she ever learned such a thing, to be angry. But she looked at Edwin Marsh's ruined face, and what she felt instead was a strange, cold clarity, Because at last, the whole ledger balanced at last, every number sat where it should. "You didn't load a gun, Mr. Marsh," she said quietly. "You lit a lamp. In a dark house. And I've been reading by it all summer, and I very nearly got to the end of the book." She leaned forward. "But I need the last pages, and only you can give them to me. Croft's own papers. The letters that pass between Croft and the Langleys. The authorizations, the receipts, anything in a Langley hand that ties them to the money. I have the shape of it complete. I have motive. I have the entail. I have the pattern of the payments. I have Harriet Langley threatening my life over a supper table. But shape isn't proof, and a judge, my husband, lives by proof, and a Richmond court will want proof, and without it, I'm just a plain woman with a wild tale that the counties already half decided to disbelieve. Give me the proof. Give me Croft's papers. And I swear to you, Edwin Marsh, whatever it costs me, I'll keep your grandchildren's names out of every line of it." Marsh looked at her a long moment. And then he said the thing she'd been dreading, flat, without drama, the way a man states a truth he has lived inside for 8 years. "They'll kill you." He said it simply. "You understand that. You're not a frightened old lawyer they can hold by his grandchildren. You're a woman with no family and no friends who's about to become the mother of the heir that ends their whole design. To them, you're already dead, Mrs. Caldwell. You're just still walking about. And the moment they see you've got Croft's papers in your hand, they'll stop threatening and start doing, and there won't be a warning first because they've already given you your warning, and there's only ever one. I know exactly what I am to them." Eleanor rose. "Which is why we can't be slow, and why we can't be seen, and why you're going to get me those papers without one living soul knowing you've done it. Can you?" He was quiet a moment, and then something settled in Edwin Marsh's tired face. Something that had not been there when she walked in, something that looked almost like a man getting his soul back after 8 years of paying it out in installments. "I've spent 8 years being the man who let it run," he said. "I believe I'd like to spend whatever's left being the man who ended it. Yes, Mrs. Caldwell. I'll get you Croft's papers. God help us both." He got her the papers. It took him 4 nights working alone after dark, copying what he dared not remove and stealing what he dared not copy. And when he brought the packet to her, wrapped in oilcloth, tied with plain string, met at the estate gate before dawn, like a thing of shame, his hands shook so that he could barely pass it over the wall. "It's all there," he whispered. The authorizations Croft acted on. His receipts, quarter by quarter, 8 years of them. And 2 letters, 2 in the elder Langley's own hand, instructing the payments, naming the estate, naming the purpose in words a child could read. He swallowed. "And one thing more. The thing I never let myself look at square until you made me go digging for the rest." He held her eyes in the gray half-light. "The physician who signed off the old judge's death. He was paid. By Croft. 3 days after the funeral. It's there in Croft's own receipts in Croft's own hand. A sum, a date, the physician's name. 3 days after we buried him." Eleanor's breath left her slow. "An apoplexy," she said. "That's what the paper says. But a hale man of 60 who checked his own accounts every dawn of his life dropped dead the one morning it suited them. And the man who wrote apoplexy on the death took Langley money for it 3 days on. And it is there now in your hand in ink." His voice was barely there. "I never let myself ask, Mrs. Caldwell, for 8 years. And now you've made me, and I find the asking was the answer all along. They murdered him. It's in the receipts. God forgive me for the years I didn't look." He was right about all of it. And he was right too about the danger, because Eleanor took the packet inside and read it through by lamplight every page, and by the time the sun was properly up, she had the whole of it whole in her mind, the theft, the entail, the physician's blood money, the 8 patient years, the murder plain in a fixer's own hand, and she made her plan. She would not go to the county court. She knew better now, and so did Nathaniel. The men who might swear a warrant, the magistrates who might hear a case, half of them dined at the Langley table. She would go to Richmond. She would take the packet to a firm the county did not own. The same strangers she'd written to weeks ago, with her careful hypothetical, and she would set the whole thing in motion where no Langley hand could reach in and smother it. And only when it was safe, only when it could not be waved away, Would she tell Nathaniel everything and put the proof in front of him? She never got the chance to do it in that order, because Harriet Langley was not a fool whatever Eleanor had let her believe over 2 suppers. Harriet had been watching too. Harriet had eyes in this county that Eleanor was only beginning to understand, the same eyes that had put 2 men in Marsh's parlor before his ink was dry 8 years ago. And a lawyer working 4 nights running, and an estate gate opened before dawn, and a packet passing hand to hand across a wall. The Langleys saw enough. They did not see everything. But they saw enough to know the plain little bookkeeper they'd frightened into silence had not after all stayed silent. And so they moved first. They did not come with men in the night as Marsh had feared they might. They were far cleverer than that, and far crueler. They came instead with a rider to the county court and a quiet word in the right ears, and by the time Eleanor sat down to breakfast on the very morning she meant to leave for Richmond, there were 2 officers of the county at the door of Caldwell House, and a warrant and a charge. The charge was against Eleanor: theft, fraud, the falsification of estate accounts. It was laid out neat and sworn to by men of standing that the new Mrs. Caldwell, a woman of no family who had married her way into a great estate and then demanded sole and irregular control of its books, as a condition of the marriage, had been discovered systematically altering those books and drawing money from the estate for her own purposes. That the discrepancies went back the better part of a decade, though of course she'd had her hands on the accounts only a few months. But a clever woman could backdate, could she not? Could forge an old hand? And here were the very ledgers in her own house, in her own possession, altered in her own ink. They had turned it around. The whole 8 years of Langley theft, the entire rotten trail Eleanor had spent a summer uncovering. They had hung it around her neck. Who had demanded control of the books the instant she entered the house, Eleanor? Who had been seen prying into old accounts, questioning clerks, writing to strange lawyers in Richmond, Eleanor? Who had at this very moment a packet of stolen estate papers wrapped in oilcloth hidden somewhere in her rooms, Eleanor? They had built her a gallows out of her own investigation. And the cruelest stroke, the one that told her Harriet's hand was in every line of it, was that the charge painted her as exactly what the county had always believed her to be. The cold, odd, grasping spinster no man had ever wanted, who'd finally schemed her way into a rich man's house and set about robbing him. It was a story the whole county was primed to swallow whole, because it was the story they'd been telling about Eleanor Whitmore for 3 years. The plain one. The clever, cold, unnatural one. Of course she turned out a thief. Didn't we always say there was something wrong with her? They had not needed to invent a villain. The county had built her 1 year ago. The Langleys had only to point. Nathaniel came into the breakfast room while the officer stood there, and he took it in his wife. The warrant, the 2 grim men, and Eleanor watched her husband's face, and it was the single worst moment of the whole terrible summer, because she saw him doubt her. Just for an instant. Just a flicker. But it was there, the reflex of a man who had been lied to and stolen from by nearly everyone he'd ever trusted, whose whole cold, armored life was built on the certainty that people were underneath it all out for what they could get. He had married a woman who'd demanded sole control of his accounts as her one hard condition. He'd found her strange from the first, too clever, too watchful forever at the books. And here were sworn men with a warrant and ledgers in her own ink. And for one instant, the whole cold logic of Nathaniel Caldwell's nature turned against his wife, and Eleanor saw in his eyes the terrible question form. Did I bring a thief into my house after all? And that single instant broke something in her that 3 years of the county's cruelty never had. Because she had let this man in. Against Aunt Margaret's warning and her own hard sense, she had left one door open, and here at the worst hour of her life, she watched him hesitate at the threshold of believing her. But Eleanor Whitmore did not weep, and she did not beg, because she had never once in her life gotten anything by weeping or begging, and she was not fool enough to start now. "They'll show you the books," she said. Her voice was steady. It cost her everything she had to keep it steady. "The altered ones, and you'll look at my hand in them, and you'll think it's proof. And I can't stop you thinking it, Nathaniel. I've no time to walk you through 8 years of ledgers with 2 officers at my elbow." She stood. She did not reach for him. She had never been one to reach, and she would not start when reaching looked like pleading. So I'll ask you one thing, and then you may believe whatever you like. When did the thefts begin? Not when did I come to this house. When did the money start bleeding out of it? Ask them to show you the date of the very first false payment. One of the officers shifted. Now, ma'am, the warrant's sworn. We've no call to— The date! Eleanor said, not loudly, but in a voice that cut clean across the room. The voice of a woman who had spent her whole life being right and being ignored and would be ignored no longer. Nathaniel, make them show you the date of the first false entry, and then ask yourself who was drawing on your estate 8 years ago, because it surely wasn't me. 8 years ago, I was a girl of 16, keeping my father's hens 40 miles from here. And Nathaniel Caldwell, Judge Coldman husband, looked at his wife and looked at the officers, and something in him steadied. The doubt did not vanish all at once, but it stopped. It held. Because whatever else Nathaniel was, he was a man who had built his entire life on the demand for proof, and his wife in the worst hour of hers had not wept or sworn or clung. His wife had asked him to check a date. A guilty woman begged. His wife did arithmetic. Let me see the ledger, Nathaniel said. Judge Caldwell, the warrant's sworn, and we're bound to— I am a judge of this county. His voice dropped into something that had frozen better men than these two. That is my estate's ledger in your hand, and my wife in my house, and you will show me the first false entry before you take one single step toward that door, or I will know the reason why, and so will every man I answer to in Richmond. He held out his hand flat and steady. The ledger. They gave him the ledger. He found the first false payment. He looked at the date. And Eleanor watched her husband go absolutely still, the exact stillness she went into over a number that told an ugly truth, and she knew he had seen it. The season of his father's death. 8 years gone, when his accused wife had been a child on another man's farm. This entry, Nathaniel said slowly, is dated the summer my father died. A backdating, Your Honor. A forgery. The woman's clever, we did warn. She was 16 years old and living 40 miles from here. Nathaniel's voice was very quiet now and very cold, and it was no longer aimed at Eleanor at all. Whose authority drew this payment? It is not my signature. It is not my father's. Whose is it? He turned a page, turned another. His finger stopped. There is a name recurs on all of these. An agent, Croft. He looked up and his eyes found Eleanor's across the ruined breakfast table, and in them was a dawning, terrible understanding. You knew, he said. This is what you've been doing all summer, in the office, with your books, all those hours. His voice caught in his throat. You weren't stealing from me. You were finding out who has been stealing from me for 8 years, and you didn't tell me. I couldn't, Eleanor said, not without proof. You'd not have believed the shape of it, I scarce believed it myself. And the moment you knew you'd have gone to them, because they're the oldest family in the county, and you're an honest man, and honest men always believe they can settle a thing by asking it straight to a person's face. Her composure cracked at last, just at the edges, just for a breath. And they'd have killed me for it, Nathaniel. The way I have become certain, the way Marsh is certain that they killed your father. The room went utterly silent. The two officers stood frozen. And Nathaniel Caldwell, who had not wept at his own father's funeral 8 years gone, who had turned to stone that season and stayed stone ever since, looked at his wife across the wreckage of their mourning and said in a voice that had come entirely undone, What did you say about my father? And Eleanor, because there was no turning back now, because the papers were hidden in her room and the officers were at the door, and the truth was, the only weapon she had left told him, fast and low and complete, the entail that gave everything to the Langleys if he died childless. The letters in this very house where his father had begun trying to cut them out. The 8 years of patient theft while they waited for a childless death. The physician paid 3 days after the funeral in Croft's own hand in the packet upstairs. And the reason it had all come to a head this summer, the reason Harriet had gone cold at a garden party, The reason the Langleys had moved now fast and vicious to destroy the plain unwanted wife they'd never troubled to fear until it was almost too late. They waited 8 years for you to die childless so the estate would fall to them clean and legal, Eleanor said. And then you married. And I'm the one thing that ends it, because the moment you and I have a child, the entail breaks, and the estate's beyond their reach forever, and 8 years of murder and theft and waiting comes to precisely nothing. She was shaking now, and she let it show, because there was no strength left to spend on hiding it. That's why they've done this. Not to steal from you, they've been stealing from you for years and been content. To be rid of me before I can give you an heir. They mean to see me hanged, or transported, or locked away, anything at all that ends this marriage before it can produce the child that ruins them. That's the whole of it, Nathaniel. That's what your own books have been screaming at you for 8 years while every soul you trusted kept you from hearing them. For a long, long moment, Nathaniel Caldwell said nothing at all. And then he turned to the 2 officers, and when he spoke, his voice was the voice of the coldest judge in Virginia, and it did not shake in the slightest. "You will leave my house," he said. "You will carry your warrant back to whoever swore it, and you will tell them that Judge Nathaniel Caldwell has examined the evidence with his own eyes, and finds it not merely wanting, but manufactured. You will tell them the judge intends to inquire personally, and to the fullest reach the law of this Commonwealth allows into who has been drawing 8 years of unauthorized payments from his estate through an agent named Croft, and into the circumstances of his father's death." He took 1 step toward them, and they gave ground before it. "And you will tell Harriet Langley, for we both know whose hand swore this warrant, that she has made one mistake this morning that she cannot take back." His voice dropped to almost nothing, and it was more terrible for the quiet. "She has finally made me open my own books. Now get out of my house." They got out. And when the door had shut behind them, and the sound of their horses had faded down the drive, Nathaniel Caldwell turned to his wife, the plain one, the least wanted, the irrelevant one, the one who would do, who had spent a whole summer quietly saving his fortune and his name, and very possibly his life, while he watched her from doorways and told himself he'd merely purchased a convenience, and he crossed the room to her at last. He did not touch her. He did not yet know how, but he stood before her closer than he ever had in the whole of their strange marriage, and he said the words that no ledger could ever balance and no contract could ever hold. "I owe you an apology," Nathaniel said. "I owe you more than I have the words for." His voice was rough and low and stripped bare of every cold thing he had ever wrapped himself in. "I chose you because I believed you were nothing. I stood in a room and told my own attorney that the plain one would do. I have spent this whole summer telling myself I'd made a sensible bargain and got a convenient wife." He shook his head slowly, and there was wonder in it, and grief, and something else that did not yet have a name. "And you are the only person in 8 years, the only soul in the whole of my life who ever tried to save me. Not one of the ones who admired me, not one of the ones who wanted me. You, the one I said would do." "Nathaniel, they never once looked at you at all, Eleanor." His voice broke clean through. "The whole county, your own cousin, my own attorney used you like a pistol and prayed you'd survive it. And I, God help me, I looked straight at you across a supper table for a summer and told myself I felt nothing." He drew a breath that shook. "I was the worst of them, because I had the most cause to see you, and I chose not to. Until now. Until they put a warrant in my hand, and I finally understood that the plain, unwanted woman I married is the finest and bravest and most dangerous person I have ever known, and that I very nearly let them take her from me before I ever once told her so." Eleanor stood very still. The accused woman, the vindicated woman, the woman who had left exactly one door open against all her own hard sense and found now that a cold man had walked all the way through it. And she found she had no arithmetic for what she felt. For the first time in her careful, guarded, numbered life, Eleanor Whitmore looked at a column and could not make it balance, and discovered to her own astonishment that she did not want to. "Then don't let them," she said quietly, "take me from you." She held his eyes. We've the proof now, Nathaniel. All of it. Croft's papers, the letters, the physician. It's upstairs this minute in oilcloth under the boards of my dressing room. They've shown their hand too soon, they've sworn a false warrant, and a false warrant is a crime. And a crime is a thread, and I have spent my whole life pulling threads until the whole cloth comes apart in my hands. Something bright and cold and unbroken came back into her plain face. They've spent 8 years hunting a childless death, and instead they've woken the two coldest people in Virginia and handed us between us a judge's authority and a bookkeeper's proof. She almost smiled. I don't reckon Harriet Langley has any idea what she's done. No, Nathaniel said softly, looking at his wife, as though he had never truly seen her until this hour, which in every way that counted, he had not. I don't reckon she does. Part 5. They did not go to the county court. Eleanor knew better, and now at last so did Nathaniel. The court's in their pocket. She said that same morning, the officers barely gone from the drive and the dust of their horses still hanging in the summer air. The men who might swear a warrant, the magistrates, who might hear a case, half of them have dined at the Langley table, and the other half are afraid of the ones who have. If we carry one page of this into that county courthouse, we're carrying it on to ground the Langleys' own outright. We'd not walk out with it. We might not walk out at all. Then Richmond. Nathaniel was already moving, already a man with a purpose, the stone in him cracking open into something faster and hotter than she had ever seen in him. Today, this hour, I'll saddle the... No. She caught his sleeve, the first time she had ever willingly reached out and touched him, and they both felt it land, and neither of them said one word about it. Not today, and not you tearing off down the Richmond Road like a man with his hair on fire. Think, Nathaniel. If we bolt for Richmond the very morning their officers leave this house, they'll know we're carrying something worth bolting for. And there is 40 miles of open road between here and Richmond, and highwaymen have been known to trouble it, and a carriage set upon by robbers. 2 travelers found dead in a ditch with their papers scattered to the wind. Who's to say it was ever anything but a robbery? Her grip tightened on his sleeve. They killed your father at his own desk and wrote apoplexy on it, and the whole county believed the paper. Do you imagine they couldn't arrange a robbery on the Richmond Road? Nathaniel went still. No, he said slowly. No, I imagine they could. So we don't run. We prepare. She let go of his sleeve. We do this the way I do everything, Nathaniel. Careful, complete, so airtight that when it finally opens, it cannot be closed again, waved away, burned, or buried. She held his eyes. You've spent 8 years being robbed because everyone around you moved faster than the truth. We're going to move slower than they expect, and it's going to end them. And Nathaniel Caldwell, who had spent his whole cold life being the one who decided, who led every conversation, who had never in his years followed a living soul, looked down at his plain wife and did the thing he had learned this summer that he could do. He followed her. All right, he said. Then tell me how. So she told him. They would not run, and they would not hide the papers, because a hidden thing could be found, and a fled thing could be caught. They would make the truth unburnable, so many copies in so many hands held in so many places, that no fire and no robbery and no false warrant could ever again make it disappear. First they would copy everything. Twice over in 2 hands, hers and his, so that if it ever came before a court, 2 witnesses of standing could swear to every page from their own writing. Croft's receipts, the authorizations, the 2 letters in old Langley's hand, the physician's blood money, the sum, and the date 3 days after a funeral. 1 full copy would go to Richmond, not by their own hands, not down the watched road in their own carriage, but carried quiet and unremarkable by a man no Langley eye would ever think to follow. And the second copy, Eleanor said, goes to the one man in this county the Langleys can't buy, can't frighten, and can't reach. Because he's already been frightened, as far as a man can be frightened for 8 years running, and he's got nothing left in all the world to lose but his own soul, and I believe he'd like the chance to get that back. Nathaniel understood at once. Marsh, Marsh. She nodded slowly. He's carried this 8 years, Nathaniel. It's rotted him hollow, I saw it on him. He put my name on that list as his one desperate throw against them, and he's not slept a night since. Give him the chance to be the man who ended it, instead of the man who let it run, and he'll walk into any court in Virginia and swear to every line grandchildren or no grandchildren. That's a man who is done being afraid. I'd stake the whole estate on it. She paused. But we have to make his courage count. A frightened man won't risk his family for a gesture. He'll risk everything for a certainty. So we give him a certainty. We make it so his one act of bravery finishes them completely past any doubt, and then his grandchildren are safe forever, because the family that threatened them will be broken and hanged and gone. And there it was, again, the thing that made Eleanor Whitmore what she was. Not that she was clever. The county had always granted her clever and hated her for it. It was that she understood people down to the very studs of them. She knew precisely what a frightened man needed in order to become a brave one, because she had spent her whole invisible life watching people from the edges of rooms, unwanted, unregarded, and therefore free to see everything precisely because no one had ever once bothered to see her. They worked 3 days, copying, ordering, building the case until it was airtight and cross-sworn and complete. And all the while for any Langley eye that watched the great house. And Eleanor was certain now that eyes watched it. They played the parts the Langleys most wanted to see. A disgraced wife under a cloud of scandal. A cold judge troubled and reconsidering. Nathaniel let it be known through the servants who talked and the servants who were paid to carry what they heard, that he was gravely disturbed by the charges laid against his wife, that the marriage was strained near to breaking, that the plain schemer had perhaps been caught out at last. And the county believed it. Every word. Because it was the story they had always wanted to be true. Of course the marriage was failing. Of course the cold judge regretted the plain, unwanted spinster he'd settled for. Hadn't they all known from the very first that it would come to nothing? Harriet Langley believed it most of all. Which was exactly why on the 4th day she came. She came alone in her own carriage, golden and glowing, and unable to resist, because a woman like Harriet could not stay away from the sight of an enemy brought low, could not deny herself the pleasure of watching the plain one break at last. She dressed it, of course, as neighborly concern. One lady calling upon another in a difficult hour. Sympathy. Kindness. But she came to gloat, and she came to finish it, and she came carrying in her own reticule the instrument of her own undoing, though she did not know that yet. Eleanor received her in the front parlor, alone, or so it appeared. She played it exactly as she had played the second supper, meek, pale, beaten-looking, a woman with the whole county's contempt come home to roost and no strength left to fight it. She let her shoulders round and her eyes drop and her hands twist in her lap. "My dear," Harriet purred, sweeping in, taking both of Eleanor's cold hands in her warm ones. "I came the very moment I heard. Such dreadful business, such dreadful, dreadful talk." Her eyes were shining. "I did try to warn you, didn't I? I said some accounts are far better left closed. I said it could be dangerous, a woman in your position with no family and no friends poking into things she couldn't hope to understand." A slow, sweet, luxuriating smile. "I only wish you'd listened to me. It would have gone so much easier for you. I should have listened," Eleanor said, low eyes down. "You were right. About all of it." "Of course I was." Harriet settled onto the settee, arranging her costly skirts, warming to her triumph. "You're not a wicked woman, I think, only foolish. You reached above your station, a plain girl of no family, marrying so very far above herself, demanding control of a great estate, as though you'd been born to it. And well," a delicate shrug, "these things end as they end." "They set me aside," Eleanor whispered. "The judge. He'll set me aside, won't he?" "He will, my dear, if you're sensible." Harriet leaned in, and now the true business began, careless and confident the way she was always careless when she believed she'd already won. "And it can all be made so easy for you. There need be no trial, no hanging, no transportation. All that dreadful talk simply vanishes." She drew a folded document from her reticule and laid it on the little table between them, one gloved finger resting upon it. My family has had a paper drawn up. A simple thing. A relinquishment. You put your name to it, you give up any and all claim upon the Caldwell estate, any claim at all, present or future, yours or your issues, and the charges disappear like morning mist. You keep your neck, you keep your freedom. You go quietly back to whatever little farm you came from, and everyone forgets the whole sad affair. We do look after our own in this county, my dear, even our mistakes. The sweet smile widened. You've only to sign. And there it was, laid on the table by Harriet Langley's own gloved hand, in a house Harriet believed held only a broken woman and her servants. A document relinquishing all claim to the estate, present or future, yours or your issues. The claim of a child not yet born. The one claim in all the wide world that the Langleys needed above every other thing to see extinguished. Eleanor looked at the paper. Then she looked up. And she let the meekness fall off her face like a dropped shawl. You put it in writing, Eleanor said. Something changed in Harriet Langley's expression, the first small flicker of a woman who has heard a note she did not expect. You needed me gone before I could give him an heir. Eleanor went on, and her voice was not meek at all. Now it was clear and cold and level, and carrying the voice of a woman reading out a column of figures that all add up true. Because the very moment there's a Caldwell child, the entail breaks, and 8 years of your family's patience turns to ash in your hands. You couldn't simply wait for Nathaniel to die childless any longer. He'd gone and married. So you had to be rid of the wife. And you couldn't quite risk killing me outright, not so soon, not so plain, not with a judge for a husband who was already somewhere in the back of his grieving mind, half wondering how his own father came to drop dead at his desk. So you built me a gallows out of your own theft instead. And when you thought I was broken and beaten and desperate, you came here yourself on this fine morning to make me sign away my own child's birthright with my own hand. She rose from her chair, slow and deliberate, and Harriet, without meaning to, drew back. And you put it in writing, Harriet. You brought into this house in your own reticule a paper that relinquishes a future claim. A future claim. Now why on this green earth would a childless, disgraced, ruined wife need to sign away a claim that doesn't yet exist unless the person who drew that paper knew exactly what that unborn future was worth, and to whom and why it had to die before it could be born? Harriet was on her feet now, and the gold had gone gray in her face. This proves nothing. A paper. A kindness between families. I'll say it was drawn up to protect you. I'll say... You'll say it to a Richmond court, said Nathaniel Caldwell. He had come in from the next room where he had stood the whole while, listening through the open door. And behind him came Edwin Marsh, hat in his hands, papers under his arm, 4 days braver than the man he had been for 8 years. And behind Marsh came 2 men that Harriet Langley did not know and would live to wish she had never seen, officers, but not county officers. Men out of Richmond, sworn to a court her family did not own and could not reach, who had ridden in quiet the night before, and taken their places behind that door before dawn, and who had heard in Harriet Langley's own carrying voice every single word she had spoken. Harriet understood it all in one terrible toppling instant. The failing marriage, the beaten wife, the gloating visit she had not been able to resist, every last plank of it built and laid without a nail out of place by the plain woman she had never once bothered to fear. And she, Harriet Langley, county champion, had walked out onto that stage of her own free will, carrying in her own hand the one piece of evidence in all the world that could not have been forged or manufactured or waved away, a document in her own family's drafting, relinquishing an unborn child's claim, laid upon the table by her own glove, spoken over in her own voice in front of witnesses from a court beyond her family's long reach. You, Harriet whispered. They never once looked at me, Eleanor said quietly. You least of all, Harriet. You looked at a plain woman in a dark dress with no ornament, and you decided the way your whole family has decided about people for 100 years, that there was nothing behind the plainness worth the trouble of watching. That was always your family's mistake. You watched the beautiful ones and the wanted ones and the loud ones because those were the only kind of people your family ever believed could matter, could threaten, could count. She took one step closer. But it was never the wanted woman you needed to fear. It was the one nobody was watching. The one you left alone in the corner of every room. Because the one nobody watches is the only one left free to watch you. It came apart for the Langleys the way these things come apart when the truth finally gets a court that doesn't dine at the guilty family's table, not in a single stroke, but completely and past all mending. The Richmond court owed the Langleys nothing and feared them not at all. The two cross-sworn copies of the case held in two hands, and two cities could not be burned or vanished or lost to any robbery on any road. Marsh swore to every line of it, and having at long last found his courage, did not lose it again. He told the whole 8 years' plain, the payments, and the two men in his parlor, and the naming of his grandchildren's schoolhouse, and the standing order to steer his master away from any true marriage, and the one desperate act of putting a plain, clever woman's name at the bottom of a list. And Croft cornered named in his own receipts, facing the rope entirely alone. Once the family that had paid him for 20 years went silent and let him swing, did what such men always do the moment their protectors abandon them. He talked. To save his own neck, he talked, and he named names and he gave dates. And the physician's blood money 3 days after a funeral stopped being a suspicion in a bookkeeper's hand and became a fact sworn under oath in a Richmond courtroom. The old judge had not died of an apoplexy. The old judge had died of the Langleys' patience running out a family that had waited as long as it could bear to wait for a sharp-eyed, tight-fisted old man to leave his fortune to a grieving son they were certain they could bleed. They had killed him for the sake of 8 years of quiet theft and the long, cold certainty of an estate that must, by the terms of an old, entail one childless death away, fall into their waiting hands. And they had come within one plain, unwanted, irrelevant woman of getting the whole of it clean and legal and unquestioned forever. It took the better part of a year for the law to finish with them. Eleanor bore every hour of it with the same steadiness she brought to a ledger. The depositions, the long journeys to Richmond, the slow public unmaking of the oldest and proudest family in the county. Harriet Langley, who had once entered every room to the sound of the whole county turning to look, entered a courtroom to the sound of the whole county turning away. The same parlors that had for 3 years called Eleanor cold and odd and irrelevant now could not say her name without dropping their voices, because the plain Whitmore girl had done what not one man in that county had managed in 8 long years. She had seen the truth. She had held it. And she had laid it on a table, in a room the Langleys could not own, where it could never again be waved away. The charges against her were dismissed entire. The county that had been so very ready, so very eager to believe her a thief, now had to look every last one of them at how quickly they had believed it, and at why. And some of them had the grace to be ashamed, and most of them had not. And Eleanor found to her own quiet surprise that she did not much care either way. She had stopped keeping her worth in the place where the parlors could reach it a long, long time ago. But there was one conversation still owed, and it was not owed to any court. It came on an evening late in the second summer, after the worst of it was behind them, when the two of them sat together in the estate office, that had become, without either of them quite deciding it, the place they came simply to be near one another. Nathaniel had taken to sitting with her of an evening while she worked. He did not always speak. Mostly, he only sat and watched her pen move down the columns, and something in the cold, armored man had gone quiet and easy, in a way it had not been in 8 years or more. He set down the letter he'd been pretending to read. "I have to ask you something," he said, "and I've been a coward about it for the better part of a year, which you'll grant is not a condition I'm accustomed to. I've noticed you managing it poorly," Eleanor said, not looking up. "Ask." He almost smiled. Then the almost smile went, and what was left was bare and unguarded. "Was it ever only a contract to you?" he said. "That's the whole of it. That's what I can't get past." He turned his own wine glass a slow quarter turn on the desk, the old gesture gone gentle now. "You could have let me hang for it, Eleanor. When they came with the warrant, you could have handed them that packet and pointed at me and walked out of this house a free and wronged woman. The real thief exposed the estate yours by right, no one left alive to say otherwise. You'd have had everything and owed no living soul a thing." His voice dropped. "Instead, you spent a summer nearly dying to save the life of a man who stood in a room and said the plain one would do. Why, was it the estate, was it strategy? Or was it— And here, the judge, the man who had led every conversation of his life, ran clean out of words and had to begin again, clumsy as a boy at his first dance. I have to know, even if the answer unmakes me. Was it ever more than the arithmetic? Eleanor set down her pen. She thought a moment about how to answer. She was not a woman who reached for people or for pretty words, and she was not about to start now by handing him a lie, not after everything the two of them had walked through to get to this quiet room. No, she said. One word, no explanation, no performance. The same plain truth she would have written at the bottom of a column that finally came out right, and Nathaniel Caldwell understood that single syllable better than he would have understood 1,000. Because he knew her now, knew her all the way down. He knew that from Eleanor Whitmore, a bare, unadorned no was worth more than another woman's weeping and swearing and clinging. No, it was never only a contract. No, it was not the estate. No, it was not strategy. All of it, the whole of her heart folded down into one word, the way she folded everything down to its truest and smallest and most honest form. I see, he said softly. And he did. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Nathaniel rose and came around the desk and knelt down beside her chair, so that for once in their marriage he was not looking down at her, but up, and he took her ink-stained hand in both of his. When I made the arrangement, he said, I had Marsh draw up a contract. An arrangement, that was the word I used. God forgive me. As though you were a boundary line to be settled. He turned her hand over slowly in his. I've had him draw up a new paper. I want to change the wording. Not arrangement. Not terms. Not an heir. Not the estate. Not the county. Not the land. He looked up at her, and his voice went rough and low and entirely undefended. Marriage. A true one. This time, not because you'll do, because there is no one else on this earth I would have and never will be. Because you are the only person in the whole of my life who ever looked straight at me and stayed. I chose you, believing you were nothing, Eleanor. And you turned out to be the only thing in this house that was ever real. He drew a breath that shook. So I'm asking you. This time I'm asking, not deciding. And this time you can say no. And Eleanor Whitmore, who had been out 3 whole seasons and never once had an offer, who had been called plain and cold and unwanted and odd and irrelevant by every parlor in 3 counties, who had been accused and near hanged, who had buried the only person who ever loved her and taught herself over long, hard years never to weep, looked down at the cold, hard, ink-stained man kneeling at her side and did not hesitate. I agree, she said. And this time, it was not a contract. This time, it was a choice. They were married the second time in the autumn, quietly, with only Aunt Margaret and a freed and steadied Edwin Marsh to stand as witnesses, and it was nothing at all like the first. The first had been signed. This one was chosen. And there is all the difference in the world between the two, and Eleanor, who had spent her life learning the exact weight of small differences, knew it better than anyone alive. The years were good to them, in the particular way that years are good to 2 people who have already survived the very worst thing and come out the other side of it still holding one another's hands. The estate ran clean and whole under 2 names now hers and his together, and the old fence line between the joined lands was long since grown over and forgotten. Eleanor kept the books, all of them, and Nathaniel long ago stopped pretending she was anything other than the true head of the house and asked her judgment before his own on every matter that mattered, and the county learned slowly and with poor grace to say Mrs. Caldwell without dropping its voice. They had a son, and it was of course a son who broke the entail forever, who put the estate past any Langley reach for all time to come. But by the time the boy arrived, that was the very least of what he was. He was theirs. He was proof of nothing and gift of everything. He grew up in a house where his mother kept the ledgers, and his father asked her opinion before his own, which was a strange enough arrangement in that county that the boy was near grown before he understood how strange it was, and stranger still before he understood how it had come to be. He was nearly a man when he finally thought to ask. They were on the northern terrace, the three of them, an evening late in the summer, with the light going long and gold across the land, and the boy, old enough now to be curious about the shape of the thing that had made him, asked the question that children eventually ask. "Mother," he said, "how did you and Father come to marry the true version? I've heard the county's version, and I don't believe a word of it." Eleanor and Nathaniel looked at one another across their son, and some whole silent conversation passed between them in that single glance, the way it had learned to over the long years, without the need of a single spoken word. "The county's version," Eleanor said dryly, "is that I schemed my way into a rich man's house. And the true one," she considered him a moment, her son, sharp-eyed, watchful. He had her own way of looking at a thing she'd noticed years ago, of seeing a good deal more than he ever let on. "Your father chose me," she said, "because he believed I was the least valuable woman in the county." She said it without a shred of pain, because there was none left in it, not one grain. He wanted a wife no other man wanted for reasons that made a great deal of sense on paper. It was not love. It was not even liking. It was arithmetic. The boy looked to his father, half alarmed. "Is that true?" "Every word of it," Nathaniel said. He did not flinch from it. He had stopped flinching from it years ago, because his wife had made of that old cruelty a thing that no longer needed flinching from. "I stood in a room full of people, and I said that the plain one would do. It was the coldest thing I ever did in my life, and the luckiest. And I did not know the difference between the two for the better part of a year. Then how?" The boy looked between them at the two joined hands, at the whole quiet, impossible warmth of the house at their backs. If it wasn't love, and it wasn't liking, and it was only arithmetic, how did it become this? What was it in the end? Was it love? Or was it strategy? Eleanor smiled. It was a small smile, and a true one. The plain woman's quiet smile that so very few people in all her life had ever troubled themselves to see. "It was preparation," she said. The boy frowned. "Preparation for what?" "For the truth." She reached over and took her husband's ink-stained hand in her own, the way she had learned over long years and at great cost to reach for people after all. "Your father built his whole life on the notion that a person is worth exactly what they can be counted for, and I spent mine being counted for nothing at all. We were both of us wrong. You see, wrong in opposite directions. And it took a summer that very nearly killed the both of us to teach us the very same lesson from two opposite ends of it." She looked at Nathaniel, and her voice went quiet and certain. "That a person's worth was never a thing that anyone else got to name. Not the county. Not a suitor. Not a ledger. Not a man deciding over an open book on a hot afternoon that the plain one would do." Nathaniel raised her hand and pressed it to his lips, and finished the thing she had started, in a voice grown gentle with all the years between. "And truth survived it," he said. "Everything they built to bury it, the theft, the murder, the 8 years, the false warrant, the very gallows they raised for your mother, all of it. And the truth still came up through the middle of it like grass through a stone. Because she would not let it lie buried. Because the one person nobody in this whole county ever bothered to watch turned out to be the only one who could see." The boy was quiet a long while, turning it over, the way both his parents turned things over. "So it wasn't love or strategy," he said at last. "It was both," Eleanor said. "It was arithmetic that learned in the end to tell the truth. And there is no stronger thing in all this world, and there never will be." The light stretched long and gold across the joined fields, and the forgotten fence line, and the great house that two people had very nearly lost, and had chosen in the end to keep, and Eleanor Caldwell, who had been named Plain, and named Cold, and named Unwanted, and named Odd, and named Irrelevant, and named a thief, and named the one who would do, sat with her husband's hand folded warm in hers, and her son at her side, and knew with the plain and perfect and final certainty of a column that adds up true that she had never once, on a single day of her whole life, been any of the things they called her. She had only ever been the one they failed to see. And in the end, she was the only one who saw everything.